Hey there, story lovers. This is N.O. Harry, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. What if Amelia Bones scanned Harry at age 9 and found 52 laws Dumbledore broke raising him illegally? Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Scanner Doesn't Lie. The scanner was supposed to be boring. That was the thing Amelia Bones kept coming back to, later, when reporters shoved quick quotes quills in her face and asked her to describe the moment everything changed. She kept wanting to say, it was supposed to be a Tuesday. Routine paperwork. Cold tea. The particular low-grade misery of Surrey in late October, where the sky couldn't decide between grey and greyer and the muggle streets all looked like someone had built them from the same uninspired blueprint. She'd been doing sweeps of the Surrey magical signature zones for 3 weeks running, ever since a memo crossed her desk from the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad. A 9-year-old boy, address unknown, had apparently caused every window on a residential street to simultaneously crack outward in a perfect starburst pattern. No injuries. Significant property damage. The reversal squad had patched the windows and obliviated 4 Muggle witnesses, filed their report, and moved on. Amelia hadn't moved on. The signature on the report was wrong. Not wrong like a mistake, wrong like a word that means something different than the person using it thinks it does. The magical output registered was triple what any 9-year-old should produce under emotional distress. Triple. She'd checked the calibration on the squad's equipment herself, hauled the scanner back to the ministry, ran it through diagnostics twice. The equipment was fine. The signature was just that large. So here she was. Black robes, sensible boots, a monocle she wore not for vision but for the detection array built into its frame, walking down Privet Drive in Little Whinging on a Tuesday afternoon while Muggles mowed their lawns and pretended not to watch each other watching each other. Number 4 had a car in the drive. A very clean car. The lawn was trimmed with the particular obsessive precision of someone who needed at least one thing in their life to be controllable. Window boxes with flowers that were clearly plastic. A garden gnome that looked like it had never encountered mud. Amelia pressed the monocle to her eye and swept the scanner, a slim brass rod about the length of a wand, with a compass face set into the grip, across the front of the house. The needle spun. Not drifted. Not crept. Spun. Full rotations, the way it did when she waved it near the Hogwarts boundary wards, or in the depths of Gringotts where the old vault magic was so thick you could almost chew it. The compass face lit amber, then deep gold, then a color she didn't have a name for, something between copper and fire, and the brass rod grew warm enough in her grip that she almost dropped it. She lowered it. Looked at the house. Looked at the scanner. Pressed the monocle tighter to her eye and ran the detection array instead, which was a different kind of seeing, not raw magical power but layered magical signature, the kind that could read not just presence but history. What she saw made her go very still. A child. 9 years old, the resonance pattern confirmed it. Young magic had a particular quality, high and clear like a bell not yet fully formed. And around that child's magical signature, wrapped so densely it was almost architectural, were wards. Not protective wards. She knew protective wards. These were something else, suppressive, mostly. Directional. Like someone had built a series of baffles around a furnace, not to keep it warm but to keep it down. And woven through all of it, unmistakable, the silver-blue thread that every trained DMLE officer learned to recognize in their first year of certification, Albus Dumbledore's magical signature. She stood on the pavement for a long moment, ignoring a Muggle woman across the street who had slowed her push of a pram to a crawl in order to watch Amelia with deep suspicion. Then she pulled out her standard DMLE documentation scanner, a second instrument, this one flat and rectangular, like a very thin book, held it toward number 4, and pressed the activation rune. The parchment that extruded from the bottom of the scanner was supposed to be brief. A standard magical registry check. Child's name, magical classification, guardian designation, any outstanding flags. The parchment kept coming. It kept coming until she had to catch it in both hands, and then fold it, and then it kept coming still, and she ended up holding a document roughly the length of her arm, covered in text so dense it was almost black, while the scanner beeped in a tone she had never heard it used before, a short, offended sort of sound, like a minor official who had just been asked something deeply improper. She read the first line. Subject, Harry James Potter. Classified, Protected Witness, Supreme Mugwump Authority. Classified, Blood Ward Subject, Supreme Mugwump Authority. Classified, Prophecy Subject, Supreme Mugwump Authority. 3 levels of Supreme Mugwump classification on a 9-year-old child. She kept reading. By the time she reached line 47, violation of Wizarding Child Welfare Act Section 12, B. Failure to ensure subject has access to magical education resources prior to Hogwarts acceptance, she had walked to the low garden wall of number 4 and sat on it, which was not something Amelia Bones typically did in the middle of investigations. She sat on things when she needed to. 52 violations. Some were administrative: failure to register change of magical guardianship, failure to file annual welfare assessments as required under the Guardianship Protocols Act of 1979. Those were serious but procedural. The kind of thing that could, in theory, be explained by bureaucratic oversight, if you were feeling extraordinarily charitable and had suffered some kind of blow to the head. Some were not administrative at all. Violation 31, application of adult-grade suppression wards on a magical minor without consent, medical necessity exemption, or court order. Violation 34, assignment of magical minor to Muggle guardianship without psychological assessment, welfare check, or legal guardian notification. Violation 38, deliberate concealment of subject status as magical heir to prevent access to family vault, trust accounts, and legal inheritance. Violation 44, suppression of subject scar-based magical resonance without medical board approval. Violation 49, failure to provide subject with knowledge of their own identity, heritage, or legal standing for a period exceeding 7 years. Amelia folded the parchment, stood up from the wall, and walked to the front door of number 4, Privet Drive. She rang the bell. The man who answered was large in a way that seemed to be made mostly of indignation: wide shoulders, red face, a mustache that bristled with the energy of someone who was already angry about whatever was about to happen. He looked at Amelia's robes and his face performed a rapid and unpleasant journey through several emotions: confusion, recognition, revulsion, and finally settling on the particular bluster of someone who is frightened but has decided that aggression is more dignified than fear. "We don't want any," he said. "Vernon Desley?" Amelia said. "Who's asking?" She held up her identification. Not a badge, the DML used folded documents, charmed to display the full authority seal only to those who could read magical impressions. To Vernon Desley it would look like a business card. The name was in plain English and the title, Head, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, British Ministry of Magic, was written in letters clear enough for any Muggle to understand. He stared at it. His mustache did something complicated. "Ministry," he said, the word coming out like something he'd tasted before and strongly objected to. "Dumbledore's lot." "The Ministry of Magic is not Dumbledore's lot," Amelia said, in a tone so controlled it could have cut glass. "May I come in, Mr. Desley? I need to speak with you about your nephew. And I need to do it now." He considered refusing. She could see him weighing it, the size of him against the authority of her, the comfort of his front door against whatever trouble was gathering on his step. Then his wife appeared at his shoulder, a thin woman with a long neck who took one look at Amelia and grabbed Vernon's arm. "Let her in, Vernon," Petunia Desley said, and her voice had gone flat and careful in a way that told Amelia she understood far more about what was happening than her husband did. The sitting room was very clean and entirely beige and had the uneasy quality of a room where nothing was ever allowed to be wrong. Family photographs on the mantel, all featuring a blonde boy of various ages and no one else. A television with a doily on top of it. A fruit bowl containing fake fruit. Amelia sat in the offered chair and did not look at the fruit bowl. "Where is Harry Potter?" she said. "In his room," Petunia said. "I'd like to see him." He hasn't done anything, Vernon said, which was such a specific thing to lead with that Amelia made a note of it. I'm not here because he's done something, Mr. Dursley. I'm here because of what's been done to him. She set the folded scanner parchment on the coffee table between them. I'm going to need you to answer some questions first, and I want you to think very carefully before you do. I am recording this interview under ministry authority. Do you understand? Petunia's hands folded in her lap. Her face had closed like a shutter. We've done everything we were asked, she said. I know, Amelia said. I know you have. I'm not here about you. She paused. What were you asked, Mrs. Dursley? In precise terms. When was Harry left here, who left him, and what were you told? What followed was 20 minutes of the most controlled, careful, and deeply revealing conversation Amelia had conducted in 11 years of law enforcement. Petunia spoke in clipped, defensive sentences, and Vernon kept trying to interrupt with bluster, and Amelia kept redirecting both of them with the patient, implacable efficiency of someone who had been in enough interviews to know exactly when a witness was telling the truth and exactly when they were protecting themselves versus protecting someone else. The Dursleys were protecting themselves. They had been told, by Dumbledore, in a letter left on the step beside the basket, that the boy had to stay. That the blood connection created a protective ward. That taking him in would protect them as well. They had been told not to contact the magical world. They had been told that if they needed anything, the old man would know. They had never been contacted for a welfare check. Not once in 7 years. He was a baby, Petunia said, and her voice cracked slightly at the edges, and Amelia looked at her and found something complicated in that crack, guilt and resentment braided so tightly they'd probably stopped being distinguishable from each other years ago. He was left on the step in October. It was cold. Has Harry been told who he is? Amelia asked. His name? His parents? A pause. He knows his name, Vernon said. His full name? His history? His parents' names? Another pause, longer. He knows his parents are dead, Petunia said. He knows, she stopped. What does he know about how they died? We told him car crash, Vernon said, and crossed his arms with the energy of someone defending a perfectly reasonable choice. Didn't want him getting ideas. Didn't want him getting wound up. You people and your world and your, Mr. Dursley. Amelia's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I would strongly advise you to stop talking. He stopped talking. Where is his room? She asked Petunia. The room, it turned out, was under the stairs. Amelia stood in a narrow hallway and looked at the door, a small door, the kind built into the triangular space beneath a staircase, with a bolt on the outside and a cat flap near the bottom. A cat flap. She looked at the cat flap for a moment, very quietly, and then she looked at the bolt, and then she straightened up and looked at Petunia Dursley, who was standing behind her with her arms wrapped around herself. How long has he been kept here? Amelia asked. He has a room upstairs now, Petunia said quickly. Since last year. We moved him. How long was he in there? Silence. Amelia crouched and slid the bolt back and opened the small door. The space had been cleaned out, used for storage now, a vacuum cleaner, boxes of holiday decorations, a broken umbrella stand. But the walls, which Amelia illuminated with a brief wordless lumos, still bore the marks of a child's long occupation. A height chart in pencil, barely reaching 18 inches above the floor before it stopped, as if someone had given up. A series of small scratches near the floor, not random, she realized, but deliberate. Counting marks. Arranged in sets of 5. She counted them. 942 days. Just under 3 years, in this space, if you counted from when he would have been old enough to make marks deliberately. She stood up. She was very careful about her expression. I need to see the boy, she said. Now. He was in the second bedroom, a real room, as Petunia had said, though real was doing significant work in that sentence. A broken cot. A single light bulb. A cardboard box with some children's clothing in it, clearly too large, clearly not new. A small stack of library books, that was the only detail that surprised her. 7 Pillars of Wisdom. A Brief History of Time. Encyclopedia of Insects, Volume 2. Harry Potter was sitting cross-legged on the floor with Volume 2 open in his lap, and he looked up when Amelia knocked on the open door, and she had one of those moments that field officers dreaded and never talked about in reports, a moment where the facts you already knew became a person. He was small for 9. Significantly small, which her healer training flagged automatically as a dietary concern. His clothes, oversized, worn, belonged to someone else. His hair was a catastrophic tangle that had clearly never been given proper attention. His glasses had a crack in one lens that had been repaired with what looked like sellotape. And he was looking at her the way that children who had learned early that adults brought trouble looked at all adults, not with fear, not anymore. Past fear. With assessment. With waiting. She had seen that look on adult witnesses in high-stakes cases. She had never seen it on a 9-year-old. Harry Potter, she said. Yeah, he said. Not nervous. Just confirming. My name is Amelia Bones. I work for the Ministry of Magic. Do you know what that is? Something shifted in his face, just briefly, the assessment cracking into something rawer and younger before he controlled it back. Magic is real, he said. And something in Amelia's chest went cold and specific and angry in a way that was going to take a long time to fully metabolize. Yes, she said. Magic is very real. And you have a great deal of it. She came in and sat on the floor across from him, which made his eyes widen slightly. She suspected adults didn't often sit on floors near him. I'm going to need to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that you can answer them honestly. Nothing you say will get you in trouble. I'm not here because of anything you've done. I'm here because some things have been done to you that shouldn't have been, and I need to understand what you know and what you don't. He watched her for a moment. The encyclopedia closed slowly in his lap. You're going to take me somewhere, he said. It wasn't a question. I may need to, yes. Would that be all right with you? Another pause. And then something she didn't expect. He looked around the room, slowly, the way you look at a place you're leaving, not with sorrow, but with the particular neutrality of someone who had decided a long time ago not to be attached to anything that could be taken from him. Yeah, he said. That'd be all right. She asked him questions for 40 minutes, and he answered them in the same way he had said yeah, directly, without performance, but also without the excessive detail of a child trying to please. He gave her facts. He didn't tell her how to feel about the facts. He'd slept under the stairs until he was 6. He ate meals when the family ate meals, which was most days, but not all. He went to the local school and was significantly ahead in every subject except that his teachers had been told not to grade him too highly. He'd known since he was very small that sometimes things happened around him when he was upset or scared, windows breaking, for instance, or a teacher's hair catching fire. He'd also known, from the reaction this produced, that it was better not to let it happen. Did anyone ever tell you why it happens? Amelia asked. No. He picked at a loose thread on his oversized sleeve. I thought maybe I was broken. She held that sentence for a moment, because holding it was the only thing she could do with it right then. You are the opposite of broken, she said, and she meant it with a precision that surprised even her. Has anyone ever told you your parents' names? He shook his head. James and Lily Potter. They died 8 years ago. You were there, you were 1 year old, and you survived something that should not have been survivable, which is why you are somewhat famous in a world you have never been allowed to know about. She watched his face go through a rapid series of expressions, shock, grief, not for something lost, but for something he'd never had, and then a strange kind of fierce interest, like someone who had just been handed the edges of a puzzle they'd been working on blindly for years. I'm going to explain all of this to you properly, Harry. But first I need you to do something for me. What? She held out the scanner. I need to wave this near you. It won't hurt. It tells me about your magic, the technical kind of information. I need it for my investigation. He looked at the scanner with the careful attention he seemed to give to all new objects, and then he nodded. She ran it along his arm, his shoulder, across the top of his head. The compass face cycled through every color she'd seen on the front step and then several more, and the warmth in the grip this time was genuinely uncomfortable, and the brass rod emitted a sound, a clear, resonant, sustained note, like a tuning fork struck very firmly, that went on for almost 8 seconds before fading. Harry watched it, his head tilted. Is that bad? He said. No, she said, and her voice was entirely steady. That is very much the opposite of bad. She pulled the documentation scanner out next and ran the full assessment. The parchment that extruded this time was shorter than the first, the individual items compiled now into a structured report, but what it said was dense enough to require a full read-through before she trusted herself to speak. The suppression wards Dumbledore had laid around him hadn't just been suppressing accidental magic. They'd been layering. Compressing. Every time Harry had produced a significant magical output, the windows on Privet Drive, the hairfire incident, various unnamed others, the wards had redirected and compressed that magic back inward rather than letting it dissipate. 9 years of compressed magical development, forced back into the source. What it had done, instead of containing him, was the opposite. It had made him a pressure vessel. Harry, she said, I'm going to take you to a safe place tonight. I have to make some arrangements, and I need to speak to some people, but I want you to know, I promise you, on my official standing as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, you will not be coming back to this house. He nodded, and she noticed he didn't look relieved, exactly. He looked like someone who had been told a fact and was filing it. Can I bring my books? He said. Yes, she said. Bring everything you want. There wasn't very much to bring. It fit in one pillowcase. Going back through the sitting room, the Dursleys both stood up, and Vernon opened his mouth, and Amelia stopped and turned and looked at him with the kind of look that had stopped more formidable men than Vernon Dursley mid-sentence. You will receive correspondence from the Ministry within 48 hours regarding your legal obligations as temporary magical guardians and your compliance with Ministry directives. I would advise you to obtain legal counsel. She looked at Petunia, who was watching Harry with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief and was probably both. Mrs. Dursley. If there is anything you want to say to your nephew before we leave, now would be the time. Petunia looked at Harry. Harry looked at Petunia. Your mother, Petunia said, and her voice did the thing where it cracked at the edges again, was the most talented person I have ever known, and I was terrible to her, and I was terrible to you, and I don't, she stopped. Swallowed. Her face closed again, the old shutters coming down, but not before Harry had seen it. I'm sorry. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. And then he picked up his pillowcase and walked to the door. Amelia followed him, and at the threshold she cast a single quick spell, a ward-reading charm, and felt the whole architecture of Dumbledore's blood wards respond. They were real. They were powerful. They were also, according to violation number 16, completely illegal without consent of subject. She filed that detail and stepped out into the October evening. They walked to the end of Privet Drive, and Harry matched her pace without being asked, and when they reached the corner she stopped and turned to him. I'm going to apparate us to London. Have you ever apparat? What is apparating? Teleportation. We disappear here and appear somewhere else. It can feel a bit strange the first time. He considered this. Okay, he said. Hold on to my arm. He did, and she apparat them both, and when they arrived in the courtyard outside the Ministry of Magic's visitor entrance, a battered red telephone box, she looked down to check on him. He was looking around at the London street, the night air, the distant sound of traffic, with an expression of complete and unshakable calm. "That was weird," he said. "It gets less weird." He looked at the telephone box. "Is that it?" "That's one way in." "Come on." They descended into the ministry, and Harry walked through the atrium with his pillowcase and his cracked glasses and his too large clothes, and the night staff stared at him, some with recognition, some with confusion, and he walked through their stares without noticing or choosing not to. Amelia took him to her office, which was on the 4th floor and had the accumulated paper architecture of a department head who had been in the role too long and organized too much. She cleared a chair of files and sat him in it and made tea, and he took the tea and looked at it and then at her. "You said I'm famous," he said. "Yes." "For what?" "For surviving," she said. "A man, a very powerful dark wizard, killed your parents and tried to kill you when you were 1 year old. The curse he used had never failed before. It failed that night, and he disappeared, and people have been." She paused. "People have been calling you the boy who lived ever since." Harry turned his mug in his hands. He looked at the surface of the tea. "Did Dumbledore know all of this?" he said. "About where I was and, all of it?" "Yes." "And he put those ward things on the house?" "Yes." "And he's the one, the 52 things you found?" "That's him." She hadn't mentioned the number 52. She'd mentioned it quietly to herself while reading, or perhaps her expression when reading it had been louder than she thought. Either way, he'd caught it. "Yes," she said, and found she didn't want to elaborate or soften it. He was asking directly and he deserved direct answers. "Albus Dumbledore, who is the most powerful and prominent wizard in Britain, the headmaster of the only major wizarding school in the country, and the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, made 52 violations of magical child welfare law in regard to your care and placement." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. "That," Amelia said, "is the question I intend to spend a great deal of time finding the answer to." He nodded slowly. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't assessment or calm or careful blankness, something younger and more jagged and entirely understandable. "What happens now?" he said. "Tonight, you'll stay here in the ministry guest quarters. They're comfortable, there's food, there are books. Tomorrow, I'm going to file charges. Then the legal process begins, and it will be complicated and loud and people will have a great many opinions about it." She met his eyes. "But here is what is not complicated, you are no longer in that house, and you are not going back, and every decision from this point forward will be made with your welfare as the primary consideration. Not as a symbol. Not as a strategy piece. Your welfare. Do you understand?" He looked at her, and she saw it, the thing she'd learned to watch for in interviews, the moment when a person decided to believe you. It wasn't dramatic. It was very small. A kind of settling. "Yeah," he said. "Okay. Good." She stood up. "One more thing. You said you thought you were broken, because of the things that happened around you. I want to revisit that." She picked up the scanner from her desk and held it out to him. "Put your hand around the grip." He took it, and the compass face lit immediately, that deep copper fire color, bright and steady, filling the small office with warm light. "That color," she said, "means the scanner can't accurately measure the upper limit of your magical capacity. It only does that for 3 categories of magical signature." She held up one finger. "Ancient, undisturbed wards, centuries old." Second finger. "Significant locations of magical convergence, like Hogwarts or Stonehenge." She held up the third finger and met his eyes. "And wizards who are classified as generational talents, once-in-a-century type power. Those are the only 3. He looked at the scanner, glowing copper gold in his hand. "The scanner broke," he said. "It ran out of scale," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Huh," he said. "Not I knew it." Not of course. Just, huh. Like a detail that had just slotted into place in a puzzle he'd always suspected existed. Amelia had interviewed 247 witnesses in her career, ranging from terrified first-years to Azkaban-hardened dark wizards. She had a reasonably good eye for people. She thought, this child is going to be extraordinary. And then she thought, he already is, and Dumbledore has been spending 9 years trying to keep that from being true. She walked him to the guest quarters, handed him a sandwich from the canteen basket, showed him the bed and the bathroom and the bookshelf, standard ministry guest issue, which ran to mostly political biographies and an outdated encyclopedia of European magical law, but Harry went directly to the encyclopedia with the expression of a person finding something interesting. "Sleep if you can," she said from the doorway. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Madam Bones," he said, without looking up from the encyclopedia. "Yes. Thank you for coming to get me." Amelia Bones was not given to sentiment in professional contexts. She had a rule about it, actually, a personal policy developed over years of a job that gave you too many opportunities for feeling things you didn't have time to feel. She set it aside, just for a moment. "You're welcome, Harry," she said. "Get some sleep." She pulled the door closed and stood in the corridor for a moment, in the particular quiet of a ministry building at night, distant hum of enchantments, the occasional draft from an unmaintained flue connection somewhere on this floor, the soft sound of a 9-year-old boy already turning pages. Then she walked back to her office, sat at her desk, picked up a quill, and began drafting the most significant charge sheet she had ever written. In the matter of Harry James Potter, Ward of the British Wizarding State, against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, this office files the following 52 counts of violation under the Wizarding Child Welfare Act of 1952 and related statutes. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping, and by the time she sealed the document and sent it by internal ministry owl to the Wisengamot filing office, the sky outside her window was the pale grey of very early morning and the first tea she'd made had gone entirely cold. Somewhere on the floor below, Harry Potter was asleep with a ministry encyclopedia on his chest. Albus Dumbledore, she imagined, was sleeping soundly in Hogwarts, certain in the way he had always been certain, that everything was proceeding as it should. She addressed a second letter, personal and urgent. Albus Dumbledore. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She wrote only 2 lines, "I have the boy. I have the scanner report. We need to talk. Bones, DMLE." She sealed it, sent it, and allowed herself precisely 1 minute of sitting. More actions request aborted. Write the next chapter now. Chapter 2, 52 counts. The Wisengamot filing office opened at 8 in the morning, and by 8:03 it had already received 3 urgent memos from Amelia's department, 2 counter-memos from the office of the Supreme Mugwump, and 1 very agitated fluke call from Cornelius Fudge, who had apparently been woken by his senior undersecretary at 6:30 and had not taken it well. Amelia was on her second cup of tea and had already changed into fresh robes by the time Fudge arrived in her office doorway, his lime green bowler hat slightly crooked, his face performing the particular shade of puce that she had learned to interpret as "I am frightened" and expressing it as outrage. "Amelia," he said. "What in Merlin's name?" "Sit down, Cornelius." "I will not sit down. I want to know why the Wisengamot has been formally petitioned for an emergency hearing on a charge sheet against Albus Dumbledore without my knowledge or authorization, because the DMLE doesn't require the minister's authorization to file charges," she said. "That's rather the point of an independent law enforcement department." She held out a copy of the charge sheet. "Read it." He didn't take it. He put his hands behind his back with the body language of a man refusing to be handed something he might be held responsible for having read. "This is Dumbledore," he said, as if this resolved the matter. "I'm aware. Amelia, he's Dumbledore. He defeated Grindelwald. He's the chief warlock, he's the supreme mugwump, people trust him. 52 counts, Cornelius." She set the parchment on the desk in front of him. "Some of them are administrative, yes. But Section 3 alone, the suppression wards applied to a minor without consent or court order, carries a minimum sentence of 2 years in Azkaban under the Welfare Act. She kept her voice level and factual, because that was always more effective with Fudge than passion. Passion gave him something to argue against. Facts just sat there. The child was housed under a staircase for the first 6 years of his life. He was told his parents died in a car crash. He has never been told his own name, his own history, or that magic exists. He is 9 years old and has never had access to any of his family's legal inheritance. Fudge opened his mouth. He has never, Amelia continued, been given a single welfare assessment in 7 years of Muggle placement. That is not an oversight. That is a pattern. Fudge closed his mouth. He stood in silence for a moment, and she watched him doing the political calculus, weighing the cost of pursuing this against the cost of not pursuing it, running the numbers on public opinion and institutional loyalty and the very specific danger of being the minister who either prosecuted Albus Dumbledore or was seen to have helped cover for him. "Where is the boy now?" he said finally. "Safe. Amelia, he's safe, Cornelius. That's all you need to know for now." She picked up her own copy of the charge sheet. "The hearing is scheduled for Friday. I'd recommend you attend. And I'd recommend you don't speak to Dumbledore before then." The look he gave her on the way out was the look of a man who was absolutely going to speak to Dumbledore before then and was irritated she'd said it out loud. She let it go. Fudge was a problem she could manage. She had bigger things to do before Friday. The guest quarters had a small kitchen attached, and when she knocked on Harry's door at 7:30 she found him already awake, sitting at the small table with the ministry encyclopedia and a plate that held the remains of what appeared to have been a very thorough assault on the full breakfast basket she'd had sent up. "You read all night?" she said, looking at the encyclopedia, which was open somewhere in the middle. "Most of it," he said, without the apologetic tone most children would use for that admission. He pushed his cracked glasses up his nose. "The chapter on magical guardianship law is interesting." She felt something that might have been amusement, carefully managed. "Is it? It says a supreme mugwump classification can only be applied to a magical minor in 3 circumstances." He looked up. "National security emergency, imminent mortal threat, or by order of the full Wisengamot." "Did the full Wisengamot order mine?" She sat down across from him. "No. So Dumbledore did it himself." "It appears so." He nodded slowly, turning a page. "And it says that classification suppresses all other legal rights of the minors, all welfare checks, all inheritance access, all family notifications. Everything just stops. Because of the classification." "That's correct." He looked at the page and said nothing for a moment, and she let the silence sit, because she was beginning to understand that Harry Potter's silences were not empty. They were working. "So the classification wasn't protecting me," he said. "It was hiding me." "That," she said, "is a very precise reading of the situation, yes." He closed the encyclopedia. He looked at the table. And then he looked up, and his expression was that same careful, contained thing, but with something harder running under it now, something that hadn't been there last night. Not anger, exactly. More like resolution. "What do you need from me?" he said. Amelia had prepared a list. She gave it to him plainly. His testimony would be needed for the hearing, but not yet, not until they knew what Dumbledore's response to the charges would be. What she needed now was a comprehensive account of his living conditions, his magical episodes, his awareness of the wizarding world, and most importantly his understanding of what he had and hadn't been told. He listened to all of this and then said, "I can write it." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Writing is easier." He paused. "I can write it clearly, and then you have it in a form you can use, and I don't have to keep saying it out loud to different people." He said it practically, not plaintively. An efficiency assessment, not a plea. She gave him parchment and a quill. He looked at the quill with some interest, tested it, and then wrote with it as if he'd been using quills his whole life, which she filed as another small data point in the growing picture of Harry Potter's adaptability. Then she left him to write and went to have the second most difficult conversation of the week. Augusta Longbottom was in her office on the third floor. She was a Wisengamot member, one of the old guard hereditary seats, and she had requested a meeting the same hour the charge sheet was filed, which told Amelia she had contacts in the filing office, which she had always suspected. She was a tall, sharp-featured woman in her 60s, with the bearing of someone who had survived considerable personal tragedy and came out of it not softened but clarified. She wore a hat with a stuffed vulture on it that should have looked absurd and somehow did not. Her eyes were the color of winter flint and about as yielding. "Sit down, Amelia," she said, in a tone that was not entirely unlike the tone Amelia herself had used on Fudge. Amelia sat. "I want to tell you," Augusta said, without preamble, "that I have been waiting for someone to do this for 4 years. That surprised her. "For years?" "Since 1985. When my son and his wife when they were put in St. Mungo's." Something moved across Augusta's face, fast and controlled. "I went to Dumbledore. I asked him, specifically, because I knew about the prophecy, I had sources. I asked him where the Potter boy was and whether he was safe and whether Neville might need to be considered in his place as the prophecy's subject." She folded her hands. "He told me Harry Potter was in a safe, secure location, his welfare was assured, and that the matter of the prophecy was not one I needed to concern myself with." "And you believed him?" "For 2 years. Because he was Dumbledore, and I was grieving, and it is the particular trap of extraordinary men. People extend them credit they have not earned simply because of what they once did. After 2 years I began asking different questions of different people and eventually concluded that whatever safe and secure meant to Albus Dumbledore, it did not mean what it ought to." She looked at Amelia. "I tried to file a welfare inquiry in 1987. It was classified. Supreme Mugwump Authority." "Precisely. I couldn't get past it. I needed someone with DMLE authority to initiate." She paused. "So. You've seen the boy?" "Yes. And?" Amelia considered how to answer this with appropriate professional restraint, and then decided Augusta Longbottom was not a woman who needed or wanted her information filtered. "He's 9 years old, he weighs roughly 20% less than he should for his height, he's been sleeping in a converted cupboard for the majority of his life, he has never been told his parents' names, and he has a magical signature that makes my scanner lose its mind." She paused. "He also read a ministry legal encyclopedia last night instead of sleeping and by morning had identified the key mechanism by which all 52 violations were concealed. So. He's fine. Considering." Augusta was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said, and the word had a weight to it. "He'll need to be. I need Wisengamot votes, Augusta. Not just for the hearing, I need enough members committed to a fair process that Dumbledore can't use his chief warlock position to steer the proceeding. He'll recuse himself. He'll have to. He should. I'm not confident he will unless someone makes it politically untenable not to." She looked at Augusta directly. "You have 7 allies on the Wisengamot I can think of without working at it." "Probably more." 12, Augusta said, without a blink. "And if the charge sheet reads the way I expect it does, I'll have 17 by Thursday evening." Amelia allowed herself a brief moment of being glad Augusta Longbottom was on this side of the table. "The boy will also need a magical guardian," Augusta said. "Someone with legal standing. The ministry can't hold that role indefinitely." "I know. I have a thought about that." "So do I. We may have the same thought." They looked at each other. "My household," Augusta said. "My household," Amelia said, at almost the same moment. A pause. "He should be somewhere he can have a peer," Amelia said. "Someone his own age." "He hasn't," she stopped, finding the clinical language harder to locate than usual. "He hasn't had that. Any of that." Augusta considered. "Neville would benefit from it too, I think." The boys are the same age, near enough. She tilted her head. Joint guardianship is a recognized legal structure. It's been done. It would require agreement from both parties. I am quite capable of agreement when the circumstances warrant. Augusta stood, which Amelia recognized as the conclusion of the meeting. File the joint guardianship application alongside the hearing papers, Amelia. I'll ensure it's supported. And, she turned at the door, keep the boy away from the press. Specifically away from Rita Skeeter. That woman has been waiting for a story like this since before you gave her one to wait for. She left, and the stuffed vulture on her hat seemed, briefly, to look back. Amelia went back to her office and found, on her desk, a scroll sealed with the Hogwarts crest. She broke the seal. Dear Amelia, I understand you have taken Harry from his placement, and I must ask that we speak as soon as possible. The situation is considerably more complex than the charge sheet implies, and I would not wish for well-intentioned legal action to inadvertently compromise the protections that have kept Harry, and by extension, all of us, safe these past 8 years. I am available at your earliest convenience. With warm regards and deep concern, Albus. She read it twice. The warmth of the tone, she noted, was not accompanied by a single acknowledgement of the boy's actual circumstances. Not one line about Harry's welfare. Not a question about how he was. Not an expression of regret about what she'd found. Just, the protections. She wrote back in 4 words, Friday. 10 o'clock. Courtroom. At 4 in the afternoon, she went back to the guest quarters with Susan. This had been a complicated decision. Susan was 11, 2 years older than Harry, and was bright and social and had Amelia's own stubborn forthrightness, expressed in a warmer register. She'd asked, when Amelia came home the previous night, why there was a strange boy's pillowcase in the ministry floor anteroom, and Amelia had told her the relevant facts without editorializing, and Susan had said that's horrible with the simple directness of a child who had not yet learned to qualify her moral responses with political considerations. It was a quality Amelia appreciated. She'd brought Susan partly because Harry needed to meet someone his own age, and partly because she thought Susan's company would be easier on him than another adult asking careful questions, and partly, she would be honest with herself, because she wanted to see how he handled it. Harry was still at the table when they came in. He'd filled 6 sheets of parchment, which he squared up neatly as they entered and slid to the corner of the table without being asked. Susan walked in, looked at him, and said, "Your glasses are broken." Harry looked at her. "Yeah. Aunt Amelia can fix that. She's good at the repair charm." Harry looked at Amelia. "I can," Amelia confirmed. He took the glasses off and held them out, and she cast the charm, and the cracked lens knit itself smooth without fuss. He put them back on and blinked a few times with the expression of someone seeing sharply for possibly the first time in a while. "Better?" Susan asked. "Yeah." He looked at her. "I'm Harry." "Susan. I know who you are, my aunt told me." "Not the famous part, the regular part." She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. "She said you read the legal encyclopedia." "Most of it." Susan pulled a face that managed to be both impressed and sympathetic. "I tried to read it once because I thought it would help me get out of a rule my aunt made. It didn't help. And it was boring." "It's not that boring," Harry said. "You are either lying or very strange." "Probably both," Harry said, and something happened in his face, a small crack in the careful containment, a brief flash of something that was almost a smile, there and then controlled back, like he wasn't quite sure yet if it was allowed. But it had been there. Amelia had seen it. Susan apparently had too, because she grinned at him as if she'd won something. They ate dinner together in the small kitchen, and Susan talked with the comfortable fluency of a girl who had grown up in a household where conversation was expected and questions were welcome. She told him about Hogwarts, she was starting the following September, and about the wizarding world and the practical terms she'd grown up with, Diagon Alley, Quidditch, the Hogwarts Express, Owl Post. Harry listened with the focused attention he gave to everything, asking occasional sharp questions that made Susan blink and then answer more carefully than she'd started. "Have you ever done magic on purpose?" Susan asked him. "No. Only by accident." "Yeah. The windows thing. And once a teacher, her hair went sort of." He gestured. "On fire?" "Just the tips." Susan considered this with clear delight. "What did she do?" "Fainted," Harry said, and this time the not-quite smile happened again, fractionally more visible. "Then they told my aunt and uncle it was a gas leak." "The reversal squad," Amelia said from across the table. "They'd have handled that." Harry looked at her. "I always thought it was my fault." "Accidental magic is no one's fault," she said. "It's like," she searched for an analogy he'd connect to. "You know how a boiler builds pressure?" "Yeah. Magical children have a release mechanism. Accidental magic is the pressure valve. It's supposed to happen. It means everything's working." He thought about this. "But Dumbledore put wards on me to stop it. Redirect it. Which made the pressure build faster and higher than it should have." She kept her voice factual. "That's part of why your signature reads the way it does." "What does his signature do?" Susan asked. "It makes the scanner run out of numbers," Harry said, which was not precisely how Amelia had phrased it but was not imprecise either. Susan stared at him. "Really?" she said. "Apparently." She stared at him a bit longer. "Then, can you do something now? On purpose?" He looked at her, then at the table, then at a glass of water sitting near the fruit bowl. He looked at it for about 4 seconds with the focused concentration of someone doing something internally that they hadn't done before, and the water in the glass rose. Not spilled, rose, a clean column of water lifting from the glass and hovering in the air, perfectly still, catching the light, while Harry watched it with his head slightly tilted. Then he let it fall back into the glass without spilling a drop. Susan's mouth was open. "Wandless," Amelia said quietly, mostly to herself. "Wandless, wordless, first attempt, age 9, clean control." She had seen trained adult wizards fail to produce half that quality of wandless magic. Harry looked at her. "Is that unusual?" "Yes," she said. "Quite." He looked at the glass of water for another moment, and this time the not-quite smile became something more definite, private, satisfied, the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected and finds the confirmation genuinely pleasing. "Cool," he said. Susan let out a breath. "You are going to be terrifying at Hogwarts," she said, and it sounded entirely like a compliment. "I'm not going until I'm 11 anyway," he said. "No," Amelia said carefully, "but I was thinking, if you're willing, we might arrange some early instruction. Private tutoring, here in London. There are things you need to know, about your history and your magic and the world you're going to be walking into. It would be better to know them before Friday." "What's Friday?" "The hearing. When Dumbledore comes." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "And I need to be there?" "Not necessarily. You're 9, the Wisengamot cannot compel testimony from a minor." "But it might," she stopped. "I won't push you on this. It's your choice." "I want to be there," he said, in the same tone he'd used for everything, direct, no performance. "He made 52 decisions about my life without asking me. I want to see him." Amelia nodded. "All right. Can I have a wand before then?" "You're underage, I know. But if I'm doing wandless magic that makes the scanner lose its numbers, maybe having a wand would help me not accidentally do something in the middle of the Wisengamot." He said it reasonably. Directed control. She thought about it. He was not wrong. An untrained child with that level of magical output and no channel for it was a safety risk, not to others, but the absence of a directed channel meant continued accidental releases, which meant the suppression wards she'd begun dismantling after taking him from Privet Drive would need replacing, which she would not do. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll go to Ollivander's." Susan made a sound that was probably supposed to be contained. "What?" Harry said. "Nothing," she said, barely containing something. "Just, Ollivander's is something. You'll see." They went to Ollivander's the next morning, the three of them, Amelia in plain Muggle clothes to minimize attention, Harry in new clothes she'd had sent up from Madame Malkin's measuring service. They'd taken his measurements by Al the previous evening and delivered a basic set overnight, and he'd put them on with the careful attention of someone who had never had clothes that fit and was not quite sure how to interact with this fact. Diagon Alley was relatively quiet at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was what Amelia had planned for. The few witches and wizards who were about gave Harry the sharp double take of recognition. The scar was visible above his new glasses, but Amelia's presence and expression discouraged approach. Harry walked through Diagon Alley looking at everything with the same focused interest he gave to legal texts and glasses of water. Not overwhelmed. Cataloging. "Ice cream shop," Susan said, pointing. "Fortescue's. He does this honey and fig flavor that is genuinely magical, and I mean that literally because I'm pretty sure he actually puts a Susan," Amelia said. Later, Susan told Harry, with conviction. Ollivander's was narrow and dusty and stacked to the ceiling with narrow boxes, and Ollivander himself appeared from the shadows in the way he always did, as if he'd been standing there already, specifically waiting, though his expression when he saw Harry went through several rapid stages before settling into an unreadable professional alertness. "Harry Potter," he said softly. "I wondered when we'd meet." "Mr. Ollivander," Amelia said. "I'd like to discuss specific wand characteristics before we begin, if you'll allow it." "Mrs. Bones." He turned his pale eyes to her. "I should tell you, I have been expecting Mr. Potter for some time. His is not a straightforward matching situation." "Why not?" Harry said. Ollivander looked at him, and something in the old wandmaker's expression shifted, the professional alertness warming fractionally into something closer to genuine interest, the way a craftsman looks when presented with unusually fine materials. "Because the wand that would suit you best has a brother," Ollivander said. "And the brother of your wand is the one that gave you that scar." Harry looked at him for a moment. "Whose wand gave me the scar?" he said. Ollivander glanced at Amelia. She gave him a slight nod. "A wizard named Tom Riddle," Ollivander said. "Who later called himself Lord Voldemort." "Is he dead?" "Unknown," Amelia said. "Probably not. But not in a condition to be a problem right now," Harry said, not as a question. "Right now, no." He thought about this. Then looked at Ollivander. "Does the brother wand matter?" "For me now, I mean. It's a consideration. It means a standard U wand is likely unsuitable, too close to the resonance and you'll get interference. It also means," Ollivander was already moving into the stacks, pulling boxes as he spoke, "that you are not a standard magical case and no wand in this shop may suit you as it should. However." He came back with 3 boxes. "We shall see." The first 2 said nothing when Harry picked them up, or rather, they said something wrong, a kind of resistance, like a key in the wrong lock. Harry set them down without ceremony. The third box, Ollivander opened slowly. "Holly and phoenix feather," he said. 11 inches. Somewhat unusual configuration. "I made this wand ready for you, actually, some years ago, when I understood what the prophecy implied." He paused. "But I confess I did not expect you for another 2 years." Harry picked up the wand. The reaction was immediate and significant. Not the showroom sparks and light effects that Ollivander's wand sometimes produced, something quieter and more substantial, like a chord struck deep in the chest, felt more than heard. The air in the shop shifted. The dust on the shelves stirred. And the wand's core lit warm gold through the holly wood, steady and clear and entirely calm. Harry held it and looked at his hand. "Hello," he said quietly, which was not the sort of thing most 9-year-olds said when given a wand. Yes, Ollivander said, softly. Quite right. They walked out of Ollivander's into the morning alley, Harry with a new wand in a holster Amelia had purchased from the accessories shop next door. She'd insisted on the holster, because a loose wand in a pocket was a liability, and he held himself slightly differently. Not more powerful. More settled, like a note that had finally found its correct pitch. Now ice cream. Susan said. Now ice cream, Amelia confirmed, because she was tired and dealing with Fudge again at 2 o'clock and the ice cream was for her as much as anyone. They sat outside Fortescue's with 3 cones, and Amelia watched Harry work through honey and fig ice cream with the focused appreciation of someone experiencing a genuinely new thing, and thought about Friday, and the hearing, and Albus Dumbledore. He's going to say he did it to protect me, Harry said, not looking up from his ice cream. She looked at him. Dumbledore. At the hearing. That's going to be his argument. He licked a drip off his wrist with the practical unconcernedness of a kid with ice cream. Probably something about the blood wards keeping Voldemort away and the obscurity keeping me safe and the suppression wards meaning I wouldn't draw attention. He considered. He'll have good reasons for all of it. Reasons that aren't wrong, technically. You've been thinking about it, Amelia said. I read the encyclopedia. All the relevant sections. He looked at her now. The problem is even if his reasons are good, the law says he needed permission and assessment and oversight and he didn't get any of those. Right? Right. So it's not about whether his intentions were good. It's about whether the law applies to him. He said it with the precision of someone who had read it clearly and was simply reporting the facts. And you think it does? I know it does, she said. He nodded slowly, turning his cone in his hand. Then, what's going to happen to him? That depends on the Wisengamot. What do you want to happen? She looked at him. It was a direct question, the kind children asked without realizing adults had spent a lot of time not answering directly. I want him held accountable, she said. Not destroyed. Accountable. I want the Wisengamot to establish that nobody, not regardless of their history, not regardless of their intentions, not regardless of who they defeated or what they built, nobody stands above the law when it comes to a child's welfare. Harry was quiet for a moment. That's good, he said. Not approvingly, practically. Like it was the right legal strategy. That way it's not about him personally. It's about the standard. Susan had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone at a tennis match, head moving back and forth, and now she said, You're both very intense, you know. Harry looked at her. Is that a criticism? He said. No, she said. It's just. You sound like lawyers. You're 9. I've been reading a lot, he said. She pointed her ice cream cone at him. When you get to Hogwarts, you should be in Ravenclaw. Where are you going to be? Hufflepuff, she said, with absolute certainty and zero apology. He thought about it. What's the difference? Ravenclaws are clever and they know it. Hufflepuffs are loyal and they don't feel the need to demonstrate it constantly. She considered. Actually maybe you'd be okay in Hufflepuff too. I've been told I'll be in Gryffindor, Harry said, which was news to Amelia. She looked at him, and he caught her look. The encyclopedia. There's a section on prophecy subjects. It mentioned historical classification tendencies. He shrugged. I'll probably go where the hat puts me. Unless you argue with it, Susan said. Can you argue with the sorting hat? I don't know. I've never tried. But if anyone's going to try it's probably going to be you. He looked at her, and this time the smile was actual and visible and reached his eyes, and it was brief and genuine and it looked like something that had been there all along waiting for a reason to come out. Probably, he said. Friday arrived with the particular weight that important days tend to carry. Amelia was in the courtroom on level 10 by 9 o'clock, and by 9:30 the Wisengamot members were filing in, and by 5 to 10 the chamber was full and humming with the subdued intensity of an institution preparing to do something it had never done before. Augusta Longbottom sat in her hereditary seat with a vulture hat and an expression like a blade. Cornelius Fudge sat in the minister's chair and looked like a man attending his own gallows. Minerva McGonagall, who Amelia had sent a formal notification to as deputy headmistress, as she was legally entitled to do as Harry's future educator, sat in the witness gallery with her mouth in a line that could have cut stone, and her eyes on the floor. And at 1:10, Albus Dumbledore entered. He looked exactly as he always looked, tall, unhurried, silver-bearded, robes deep blue with star patterns moving slowly across them. He looked like someone's idea of wisdom. He looked at the chamber with calm authority, nodded to several members by name, and sat in the respondent's chair as if it were entirely ordinary for him to be sitting in it. Then his eyes found Harry. Harry was in the front row of the witness gallery, next to Susan, in the new robes Amelia had provided. He was sitting straight. He held his wand in its holster at his wrist. His expression was clear and composed and entirely without performance, and when Dumbledore found him and their eyes met, he held the look without blinking. Something moved across Dumbledore's face. Regret, possibly. Or recognition. Or both. Amelia stepped forward. "This hearing is now in session," she said. "The matter before the Wisengamot is the charge sheet filed against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, 52 counts under the Wizarding Child Welfare Act and related statutes, in the matter of Harry James Potter." She let the words sit in the air. "Shall we begin?" Dumbledore folded his hands in his lap, met her eyes across the chamber floor, and said, very quietly, "Yes, Amelia. I believe we shall." Chapter 3. What the Magic remembers. The hearing lasted 4 hours on Friday and resolved nothing. That was not a failure. Amelia had planned it that way. The first session was procedural, establishing the charge sheet, confirming the DMLE's jurisdiction, dealing with 3 separate motions from Dumbledore's legal representative, a precise and silver-tongued wizard named Cassius Greenwald who had defended half the significant magical cases in the past 30 years and wore his certainty like a second set of robes. He challenged the scanner evidence on technical grounds, questioned the chain of custody on the documentation parchment, and filed a motion to classify the entire proceeding under the Supreme Mugwump Authority, the same authority, Amelia noted for the record, that had been used to conceal the violations in the first place. That last one failed. Augusta Longbottom called for an immediate vote on it, 17 hands went up against, 9-4, and Greenwald's silver tongue paused just long enough for her to see the calculation behind his eyes recalibrating. Dumbledore said almost nothing through the procedural session. He sat in the respondent's chair and listened and occasionally conferred quietly with Greenwald, and his expression throughout was the expression of a man who had absolute confidence in the reasonableness of his own position and was simply waiting for the correct moment to explain it to everyone. Harry watched him the entire time. Not with hostility. Not with the wide-eyed attention of a child watching something overwhelming. He watched Dumbledore the way he'd watched the water glass before he lifted it, focused, assessing, completely still. At the lunch recess, Amelia sent him and Susan to the ministry canteen with a list of instructions about what he was and was not allowed to say if anyone approached him, and went directly to the small conference room off the courtroom corridor where she'd scheduled what she privately thought of as the most necessary and most unpleasant conversation of the week. Minerva McGonagall was already there, standing by the window, which looked out onto an enchanted vista of the Scottish Highlands that the ministry used to make windowless interior rooms feel less bleak. She had a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. Her back was to the door. "Minerva," Amelia said. McGonagall turned. Her face was doing something complicated and controlled, which Amelia had learned to read as the McGonagall equivalent of genuine distress. "I placed him there," she said, without preamble. "I know. I went to Privet Drive the day after, the day of November 1st, 1981. I sat outside that house and I watched the family." She set the tea down. "I told Albus I didn't like it. I told him the Dursleys were the worst sort of muggles. I told him it seemed wrong to leave the boy on a doorstep like a milk bottle. He told me the blood wards required it, and that the protections they'd provide were worth more than any concern I might have, and she stopped. And you deferred, Amelia said, not as an accusation. I deferred. McGonagall said the word like it tasted like ash. I have been deferring to Albus Dumbledore since before you were born, Amelia, which does not excuse it. I checked on the house once, in 1985, through a squib contact in the area, a woman named Arabella Figg, who Albus had placed there to observe. There was a squib observer. Yes. Living 2 streets away. McGonagall's jaw tightened. She reported that Harry was healthy and the family, while not warm, were functionally adequate. Her words. I now understand she had very limited actual access to the boy and was mostly observing from a distance, but at the time it was enough to quiet the part of me that knew something was wrong. She looked at Amelia directly. What do you need from me? Your testimony, ultimately. But today, I need you to tell me everything you knew about the prophecy and the placement, and I need it on record. McGonagall nodded. She sat down, straightened her already straight spine, and began to talk, and Amelia took notes, and what emerged over the next 45 minutes was a portrait of a woman who had raised quiet, persistent concerns through private channels for 8 years and been answered each time with Dumbledore's absolute certainty that his plan was the only viable one. One detail landed harder than the others. He knew, McGonagall said, about the suppression wards. He told me, in 1982, when I asked why Harry's magical signature wasn't registering on the annual Hogwarts intake preliminary scans, he told me he'd applied directional wards to prevent the boy from drawing attention that could endanger him. He said they were temporary. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. She paused. There's a difference, and I've spent the better part of this week sitting with it. Amelia closed her notebook. Will you testify? Fully. Including the parts that don't reflect well on you? McGonagall looked at her. I did not protect that child as I should have. I will not compound the failure by protecting myself now. They returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, and the afternoon session was where Dumbledore finally spoke. He asked for the floor, and it was given to him. He was, after all, the chief warlock, though a motion to have him step down from that role for the duration of the proceedings had been filed and was pending, and he stood and addressed the Wizengamot with the measured calm of someone who had spoken to large bodies of powerful witches and wizards so many times that the architecture of persuasion came naturally as breathing. He acknowledged the violations. All 52, plainly, without Greenwald's deflection. That surprised the room. She could feel it, a collective readjustment, a recalibration of expectations. I will not argue that these statutes were not violated, he said. They were. The documentation is precise and accurate, and I will not waste this chamber's time with denial. He paused, letting that register. What I will ask is that this chamber consider the context in which each decision was made. In the autumn of 1981, Voldemort's forces were actively operating throughout Britain. We had lost good witches and wizards every week for 3 years. The prophecy, we'll be entering the prophecy text into the record when it's unsealed, Amelia said. Quite right. The prophecy indicated that Harry Potter possessed a capacity that made him uniquely dangerous to Voldemort, and by extension, uniquely targeted. Every decision I made about his placement and his protection was made with one objective: to keep that child alive long enough to understand what he is and what he may one day need to do. He let his eyes move across the chamber, and they were kind eyes. She had to grant him that. They were genuinely, terribly kind. I made those choices without the legal framework this proceeding requires, and I accept that responsibility. But I ask you to consider, if I had followed procedure, filed applications, requested welfare assessments, notified extended family, how long before that information reached Voldemort's remaining supporters? How long before someone with Ministry access and Death Eater sympathies used those documents to find the boy? It was, Amelia noted, a genuinely good argument. It was the argument she had been preparing to answer for 3 days. With respect, she said, standing, the Supreme Mugwump classification provides exactly the security clearance that would prevent that information leak. If you had used it for the purpose it exists, classification of a protected witness, the information would have been sealed at the highest ministry security level. The welfare assessments, the guardianship reviews, the annual checks, all could have been conducted under that seal, invisibly and securely. You chose not to use the classification for its legal purpose. You used it instead to remove the legal framework entirely, which is not the same thing. She paused. The law provides you the tools to protect this child legally. You did not use them. That is not a bureaucratic technicality, Chief Warlock. It is the difference between protection and control. The chamber was quiet. Dumbledore looked at her across the floor, and for the first time that day, his expression shifted. Not defensively. Something more honest than that, the look of someone who had just heard their own argument reflected back at them clearly and was recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that it had a hole in it. There is truth in that, he said quietly. Yes, she said. There is. She called the session to close and scheduled the next hearing for the following Wednesday, and as the chamber emptied and the Wisengamot members filed out, she looked toward the witness gallery and found Harry's seat empty. He and Susan had left during Dumbledore's address. She didn't think it was distress. She'd been watching him during the procedural session and he hadn't looked distressed, he'd looked like someone filing information. More likely he'd simply collected enough for the day and removed himself, which was something she was beginning to understand was a habit of his. He took what he needed and moved on. She found them back in the guest quarters. Susan was talking about Quidditch, which she did periodically and with great energy, and Harry was listening with polite interest and eating a biscuit. He looked up when Amelia came in. The blood ward argument, he said. He didn't mention that the blood ward could have been maintained even if I'd been placed with a different magical guardian, did he? She sat down. What do you mean? The ward works off Lily Potter's sacrifice, blood protection. The encyclopedia section on historical ward magic says it's tied to a willing sacrifice and the love intention behind it. The Dursley connection was just the anchor point, the place where my mother's blood ran through a living relative. But the love intention is what powers it. He turned the biscuit in his fingers. It doesn't require misery to function. That's not in the ward construction. He chose the Dursleys for the anchor point, but there were other relatives my mother's blood ran through. Petunia wasn't the only option. Amelia stared at him. How long have you been thinking about this, she said. Since last night. I asked one of the ministry librarians if I could access the historical ward magic section through the reading room. She let me in. He ate the biscuit. The ward would have anchored to any living blood relative with love intent toward me. My father had cousins. Second cousins, at least. His family vault at Gringotts, he paused. I can access Gringotts, right? My family vault? Yes. That's on the charge sheet, violation 38. We can arrange access. Okay. He nodded, filing it. But the point is, Dumbledore chose specific misery and isolation when other options existed. The protective intent behind the ward didn't require any of it. Susan was looking at him with the expression she'd been wearing most of the week, which was the expression of someone watching someone else do something extraordinary with an ease that ought to be impossible. Harry, she said. Yeah. I'm going to say this nicely. You're extremely alarming. He looked at her. Good alarming or bad alarming? Good alarming. Definitely good alarming. She paused. But still alarming. The ward magic thing is important, Amelia said, and she was already reaching for her notebook because it was. It was the argument she hadn't had yet, the clean, simple demolition of Dumbledore's central justification. If the protections didn't require the specific suffering, if isolation and deprivation and identity suppression were choices, not necessities, then the 52 violations weren't regrettable collateral damage of an emergency wartime decision. They were just choices. Made by one man, for reasons that may have had more to do with control than protection. I need you to write that down, exactly as you explained it, with the references. He reached for a quill without being asked. She went to bed that night thinking about what Dumbledore had said, to keep that child alive long enough to understand what he is and what he may one day need to do. Not, to give that child a life. Not, to let that child be a child. Not even, to let that child know that someone cared whether he lived or died. Just, to keep him alive. Like a piece on a board. She was less angry at Dumbledore than she expected to be, and that bothered her more than the anger would have. Anger she understood. What she felt was closer to grief, the particular grief of watching a good man's certainty calcify into something he couldn't see past. The magical evaluation was scheduled for Saturday morning. She had requested a full assessment from the Department of Mysteries, specifically from the Unspeakable's Magical Analysis Division, which had the equipment for high-end signature readings and whose findings were inadmissible in court but useful for understanding what they were actually dealing with. She'd also requested a healer from St. Mungo's for a standard physical assessment, because Violation 17 was failure to provide magical healthcare access, and she needed documentation of the physical consequences of Harry's care, and she wanted a baseline before any interventions began. The healer arrived first. Her name was Pomfrey, an older witch with efficient hands and no-nonsense grey hair, who ran her diagnostic spells over Harry with brisk professional speed and then stood for a moment looking at the results with an expression Amelia had learned, in doctors, meant I am composing what I'm about to say very carefully. Nutritional deficiency, moderately severe, primarily iron and vitamin D, consistent with limited sun exposure and a restricted diet over several years, she said. He's small for his age but his bone density is actually higher than expected, which is unusual and probably magical in origin. The scar on his forehead is not a conventional scar, there's residual dark magic in it, old and deep, which I am absolutely not qualified to assess and which someone should look at with considerable urgency. She paused. He's also significantly sleep-deprived in the chronic sense, not from this week, from years. His body has been running on less sleep than it needs for a very long time, probably because he was in a space where he wasn't comfortable enough to sleep deeply. She said all of this to Amelia, beside Harry but not quite addressing him, which was the habit of medical professionals with child patients that Harry apparently found slightly maddening. She could see it in the fractional tightening of his jaw. "I'm here," he said mildly. "You can tell me." Pomfrey looked at him and then, recalibrating, addressed him directly. "You're malnourished, you're sleep-deprived, you need sunlight and iron supplements, and there is something in your scar that a specialist needs to examine. Most of these are fixable quickly. The scar thing needs proper attention." She held out a small bottle. "Iron supplement potion, 1 swallow a day, tastes like blackcurrant. And sleep. Real sleep. In a comfortable bed." "He's been sleeping in the ministry guest quarters," Susan said helpfully. "And is the bed comfortable?" Pomfrey asked Harry. "Better than what I had before," he said. "That's a very low bar, young man." She packed her case. "I'll send the report to DMLE and a copy to the Weisengamot file." She looked at Amelia. "There are going to be people who argue the physical findings are within normal variation for a muggle-raised child." "Are they?" "No," Pomfrey said flatly. "They are not. They are consistent with chronic neglect. I will say so, clearly, in the report." She left, and the Unspeakable's team arrived, 2 of them, in their Department of Mysteries hoods despite being in Amelia's office, which she'd always found unnecessary but had stopped arguing about. They carried a piece of equipment she'd never seen, a flat circular platform about 2 feet in diameter, covered in engraved runes, connected by 3 slim golden rods to a central column that ended in a crystal array. "This is a resonance mapping array," the shorter Unspeakable said. "Standard high-output evaluation. We'll need the subject to stand on the platform and produce a magical output. The level and type don't matter, but it should be intentional rather than accidental." Harry looked at the platform, then at Amelia. She nodded. He stepped onto it. He looked down at the runes for a moment, then looked up at the crystal array, and his expression settled into that focused stillness. He held out his holly wand. "How much?" he said. Whatever feels natural, the unspeakable said. He cast a simple lumos. The reaction was not simple. The crystal array lit so intensely that everyone in the room took an involuntary step backward. The runes on the platform flared through a cascade of colors too fast to follow, and the 3 golden rods vibrated with an audible harmonic tone, and the mapping column produced, from a slot at its base, a parchment that was so covered in the dense fractal pattern of a resonance map that it looked almost black from a distance. Harry let the light die and stepped off the platform. The unspeakable picked up the resonance map and looked at it for a long time. Well, they said. Well, what? Harry said. The unspeakable looked at their colleague. A look passed between them. How much do you know about magical theory? The taller one asked Harry. Depends on the theory, Harry said. Magical cores, the central source of a witch or wizard's power, typically exist in one of 3 configurations. Singular, which is the most common. Compound, which occurs in roughly 1 in every few hundred magical people and represents a layered or multi-strand core. And then there's a theoretical 3rd category. They paused. Theoretical, because documented cases in the last 2 centuries number exactly 4. What's the category? Harry said. Bound resonance. Where a magical core has been artificially compressed, typically through external wards, as in your case, it develops what we call recursive depth. The magic folds inward on itself and creates layers, they seem to be searching for an analogy, like the difference between a coiled spring and a solid rod. Both are the same material. Same mass. But the coil has stored potential that the rod doesn't. So the suppression wards, Harry said, made me stronger. Made your core more complex, the unspeakable said carefully. Which in practical terms, yes, does result in significantly elevated magical output capacity. But it's more than that, the recursive depth means your magic has range, not just power. Multiple types of magical workings at levels most trained adult wizards can't access. Wandless. Wordless. Historical spell types that have effectively been dead arts for generations, because the core depth they require doesn't exist in modern practitioners. They looked at the map again. You are, in technical terms, an anomaly. But a functional one, Harry said. Very. He looked at the map they were holding, at the dense fractal pattern of his own magical core laid out in 2 dimensions. Can I have a copy of that? He said. The unspeakable looked at Amelia. She nodded. They handed him a duplicate. He held it up to the light, examined it with the focused attention of someone learning to read a new language, and then rolled it up neatly and held it. Thank you, he said, and he said it directly and sincerely, not automatically. When the unspeakables had left, Susan, who had been sitting very quietly in the corner for the last 20 minutes, said, Okay, so, stored spring energy, ancient dead arts, and anomaly. Those are the adjectives we're working with. Seems like, Harry said. You're taking this very calmly. He thought about it. Would being upset about it change anything? No, but most people would still be upset. Or excited. Or something. He considered this. I've been doing magic since I was small and being told it made me wrong. Finding out it actually makes me very right is. He paused, and the private smile came back. It's good. I'm fine with it. You're fine with finding out you're basically a magical phenomenon. There are worse things to be, he said. She stared at him for a second and then burst out laughing, which made him look surprised and then genuinely pleased in a way that Amelia noted and filed under important, keep Susan around. The rest of Saturday was divided between reading, one brief and carefully managed walk through a quiet section of Diagon Alley, and what turned out to be an unexpectedly significant conversation over dinner when Augusta Longbottom arrived with Neville. Neville was 9 years old, round-faced, sturdy, and arrived holding a large ceramic pot containing a Mimbulus Mimbletonia, which he set very carefully on the table beside his dinner plate and then looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had been told they were about to meet someone significant and was now unsure what the protocol was. This is Neville, Augusta said. Neville, this is Harry Potter. Hi, Neville said. Hi, Harry said. He looked at the pot. What's that? Neville's face transformed. It's a Mimbulus Mimbletonia. It's very rare, Gran got it for my birthday. It uses stink sap as a defense mechanism instead of thorns, which is unusual for a plant this size, and it communicates through. Does it actually communicate? Like, sentient level response to stimulus? Harry said. Neville stared. Yeah. It responds to contact and to spell work in ways that suggest basic magical awareness. Most people don't, he paused. Most people don't know that. I read about Mimbletonia in the Magical Botanical Compendium, Harry said. There was a section on magically aware plant life. It was interesting. Neville looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Susan, who was sitting next to Harry. Susan mouthed he reads everything and shrugged slightly. Can I? Neville gestured at the chair across from Harry. Yeah, Harry said. Tell me about the stink sap. Does the mechanism activate at a distance or does it need contact? Neville sat down with the expression of someone who has unexpectedly found something wonderful, and began talking about his plant, and Harry listened and asked questions that were increasingly specific and genuine, and Augusta sat at the end of the table and watched the two boys with an expression that Amelia caught and quietly shared. Dinner took 2 hours and by the end of it, Neville had asked Harry if he wanted to see the Longbottom greenhouse collection, which was apparently significant and extensive, and Harry had said yes without hesitation, and they had made a plan for the following weekend as if they'd been doing this for years. After Augusta left with Neville, Susan said, You actually like herbology. I like how it works, Harry said. The magic in plants is structural, not applied. It grows into the plant itself. That's different from how we use magic. Is it relevant to anything? Maybe. He looked at his resonance map, which he'd unrolled and set beside his plate at some point in the evening. The recursive depth thing. The unspeakable said it's like coiled potential. Plants grow their magic structurally too. He traced a line on the map. I want to know if I can learn the same way. Amelia decided, looking at him, that she was going to need to arrange actual instruction very soon, because Harry Potter thinking unsupervised in a ministry guest room with a resonance map and a growing theoretical framework was either going to produce something extraordinary or something that inadvertently cracked the building's foundations. Sunday brought a different kind of complication. At 8 in the morning, a barn owl arrived with a letter addressed in handwriting she recognized, thin, precise, the particular penmanship of someone who wrote a great deal and maintained a standard about it. Albus Dumbledore wanted to meet with Harry. Not the hearing. Privately. He wrote that he had things to say directly to the boy that were better said without the Wisengamot chamber as witness, and that he believed Harry deserved to hear them from him personally rather than through the filter of legal proceedings. She read the letter twice, then took it to Harry. He read it once. I'll meet him, he said. You don't have to. I know. He folded the letter neatly and put it on the table. I want to hear what he says when he's not trying to manage the room. I'd be present, she said. That's fine. You're sure? He looked up at her. He's a person who made choices about my life. I want to look at him and hear him explain himself without the arguments and the legal structure around it. That seems important. He paused. I'm not afraid of him. She believed that completely. And she thought it was the most significant thing she could say about Harry Potter 9 days after finding him in a room under the stairs. He was 9 years old, and had just been told that the most powerful wizard in Britain had shaped his entire existence, and he was not afraid. He was interested. Monday morning, she said. Here. My office. Okay. She sent the reply, and on Monday morning, Albus Dumbledore came to the ministry and sat in the chair across from Harry Potter for the first time. He looked at Harry for a long moment before speaking, and his expression, unfiltered, in a small office rather than a grand chamber, was something that looked genuinely like pain. Harry, he said softly. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. You may call me Albus, if you like. I don't know you well enough for that yet, Harry said, not rudely, just precisely. Dumbledore accepted this with a small nod. I imagine there is a great deal you want to ask me. Yes, Harry said. But I want you to go first. Tell me what you want to tell me. Dumbledore looked at him for another moment, and Amelia had the sense of a man recalibrating. He had, she suspected, come prepared for a frightened child, or an angry child, or a confused child. He had not come prepared for this. He talked for 30 minutes. He explained the prophecy, as much as he could without unsealing it. He explained Voldemort, Riddle, his rise, his methods, the war that killed Harry's parents. He explained the Blood Ward, its mechanics and its necessity as he understood it. He explained every choice in a voice that was measured and careful and entirely without self-pity, and the thing that struck Amelia was that he was clearly telling the truth, all of it, plainly, without the chamber management and the careful framing. This was what he actually believed. Harry listened to all of it without interrupting. When Dumbledore stopped, Harry said, the Blood Ward didn't need the Dursleys specifically. It needed living family blood. You had other options. Dumbledore's hands, folded in his lap, were very still. I believe the isolation was necessary, for the protection or for the prophecy. A pause. I'm not certain I understand the distinction you're making. The Blood Ward protects me from Voldemort, Harry said. The isolation kept me from knowing who I was. Those are different objectives. He looked at Dumbledore directly, and his voice was entirely level. Did you need me to not know who I was? For the plan? The silence this time lasted long enough to be its own answer. I believed, Dumbledore said finally, and his voice was quieter, that a child who grew up knowing what he was, who he was, might not be able to carry what needs to be carried. I was afraid of what certainty and fame might do to a 9-year-old boy. Harry nodded slowly. So you chose what deprivation and isolation would do instead. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in his face had changed, not broken, exactly. Shifted. The absolute certainty that had always been there, that she had seen in his expression in every hearing in every Wisengamot session for 30 years, had a crack running through it. I was wrong, he said. Not in every particular, I still believe you needed protection and obscurity, and I still believe Voldemort is not finished. But in how I provided that protection. He met Harry's eyes. I should have found a way. The law provided me tools I didn't use. You were a child, not a piece on a board, and I treated you as a strategy, and that was wrong, and I am sorry. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Thank you for saying that, he said. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just directly. I believe you mean it. I do. Meaning it doesn't change the 52 counts, Harry said. You understand that. I do. And whatever happens at the hearing, Harry continued, I'm not going back to the Dursleys. I'm not going to be managed. And whatever the prophecy says, whatever I'm supposed to do about Voldemort, I'll do it on my own terms. Not yours. Dumbledore looked at him. The crack in the certainty widened fractionally, and for a moment, just a moment, what was underneath it looked something like wonder. I believe you will, he said. And then, softly, you are remarkably like your mother. Something moved in Harry's face. Fast and young and real, there before he controlled it. Tell me about her, he said. And Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard in Britain, sitting in a ministry office chair with a charge sheet hanging over him and a reckoning still 4 days away, talked about Lily Potter for an hour. He talked about her cleverness and her warmth and the particular way her magic worked, intuitive, emotional, beautiful, and he talked about James, reckless and brave and funny, and he talked about the night they died with the first genuine grief she'd heard in his voice all week. Harry listened to every word. He didn't cry. But when Dumbledore finally stopped, he reached out and picked up his wand from the table, that small, grounding gesture, his hand around the holly wood, and held it for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "For that part." On Wednesday, the hearing resumed. Amelia entered the ward. Magic evidence Harry had uncovered, the analysis of Lily Potter's blood ward and its anchoring requirements, and watched it do exactly what Harry had predicted. It didn't destroy Dumbledore's argument, it reframed it. It established, cleanly and specifically, that the choice had been made, not imposed by necessity. Greenwald tried to counter with an expert of his own, a ward specialist named Flint, who spent 40 minutes arguing that the Dursley placement had been uniquely optimal and alternative anchoring would have presented significant risk variables. Harry, sitting in the witness gallery, listened to Flint's argument, and then leaned slightly toward Amelia and said, very quietly, "His third premise is wrong. The love intent clause in the ward construction doesn't require sustained proximity, it requires established intent at time of placement. The anchor only needs to be willing at the casting. He's conflating anchor maintenance with anchor establishment." She looked at him. "I read the original ward patent documentation," he said. "It's in the Department of Mysteries archive." I asked the librarian. She had not known he had done that. She made a note to ask the ministry librarian what else Harry Potter had been reading. Then she stood up and made Flint's third premise collapse in front of the Wisengamot with the precise, clean devastation of someone who has done their research. Flint looked at his notes, looked at her, and sat down. Dumbledore, across the chamber, looked at Harry. Harry met his eyes. And something passed between them, not warmth, not quite, but the particular regard between two people who are on opposite sides of a clear line and have both decided they understand the other's position and it doesn't change where the line is. Outside the courtroom, in the corridor afterward, with the Thursday evening light coming through the enchanted windows and the ministry winding down around them, Susan fell into step beside Harry and said, 2 days. 2 days what? He said. Until the verdict. Are you nervous? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he seemed to think about anything. No. Whatever they decide, I'm not going back to Privet Drive. I have a wand. I know what I am now. The legal part is, he paused. It matters for what it means. For whether the standard gets set. But for me personally, it's already settled. She looked at him. You sorted all of that out in 9 days. I had good information, he said simply, and glanced at Amelia. She turned away before the expression on her face could become something she'd have to manage. Right, Susan said, catching up. So. Since we're not nervous. Ice cream. It's 7 o'clock, Amelia said. Fortescue's does evening hours, Susan said. I checked, Harry added. She looked at both of them. 9 years old and 11 years old, and between them the particular irresistible certainty of 2 children who had already decided the answer was yes. Get your cloaks, she said. They went, through the cooling evening, down into Diagon Alley, and sat outside Fortescue's with ice cream in the October dark, and the wizarding world moved around them, witches and wizards heading home, the lights of the shops warm and gold, and Harry Potter ate honey and fig ice cream and looked at all of it, this world that had always been his and never been given to him, with that steady, unperformative attention. Learning the shape of a thing he intended to know completely. Chapter 4, The Boy Who Chose the Gringotts Owl arrived Tuesday morning with a formality that managed to feel vaguely threatening even in letter form. It was rolled in bronze-colored parchment, sealed with wax that had actual goblin script pressed into it, and addressed in letters that were slightly too angular to be entirely comfortable. Amelia set it beside Harry's breakfast without comment and watched him break the seal with the matter-of-fact efficiency he applied to most things. He read it, finished his toast, and read it again. They want a meeting, he said. Gringotts always wants a meeting when a vault account has been inactive past the heir's 7th birthday, Amelia said. Violation 38 triggered an automatic notification to their legal department when it went into the charge sheet. They've been waiting. What's in the vault? I don't know the specifics. Family holdings, trust accounts, probably some property assets. The Potters were an old family, significant magical lineage going back several centuries. Old families tend to accumulate. He looked at the letter again. It says Senior Account Manager. That's their highest tier. Yes. He folded the letter precisely. Can we go today? She had 3 depositions to review and a call from Fudge's office she'd been avoiding for 2 days. She looked at Harry, who was sitting with the focused patience of someone who had learned that asking twice didn't help and waiting did, and pushed the depositions to afternoon. After breakfast, she said. Gringotts was everything it had been the first time she'd walked him through Diagon Alley and more, the marble floors, the goblin tellers in their long rows, the particular atmosphere of a building that took the security of wealth with a seriousness that bordered on religious. Harry walked through the main entrance and looked up at the ceiling and at the tellers and at the vaulted architecture with calm interest, and a goblin at the nearest desk looked up and went very still. Then, with a composure that was very goblin and very deliberate, he reached under his counter and pressed something, and a soft chime sounded somewhere in the building. They were met at a side corridor by a goblin named Ragnarok, short even for a goblin, with the particular sharpness of eye that indicated either great intelligence or great irritation, and in Ragnarok's case Amelia strongly suspected both, who led them through the marble corridors to a meeting room that was better appointed than most ministry offices, with dark wood paneling and 2 chairs clearly designed for humans and one behind the desk clearly designed for a goblin who wished to appear slightly larger than they were. Ragnarok sat. Opened a ledger. Did not look up immediately, which was a power move so old it was practically geological. Harry sat across from him and waited. Eventually Ragnarok looked up, and his eyes went directly to Harry's scar with the undisguised focus of someone reading a document. Harry James Potter, he said. Heir to the Potter Family Trust and the Black Family Secondary Bequest. Both? Harry said. Your maternal grandmother was a Black before she married. You are the sole surviving heir of the secondary line. Ragnarok turned a page. The Black Family Primary Trust is currently in dispute, which is a separate matter and not our concern today. What is our concern today is the Potter Trust, which has been accruing since your birth, and the status of several property assets which require heir confirmation. He looked up again. You have not been presented to Gringotts for heir confirmation. This should have occurred on your 7th birthday. It did not. We were not pleased. That's on the charge sheet, Harry said. Violation 38. Ragnarok looked at him. Not with surprise exactly, goblins didn't do surprise, they did sharp recalibration. You've read the charge sheet. I helped write part of it. A pause. Ragnarok made a small sound that was either professional approval or indigestion. The trust account, he said, and slid a document across the desk. Current balance. Harry looked at the number. His expression didn't change significantly, but something in his posture settled in the way of someone who has just had a vague worry resolved. The property assets, Ragnarok continued, pulling a second document, include the family home in Godric's Hollow, currently sealed, structurally damaged from the incident of 1981, and held in trust pending heir decision. A cottage in the Scottish Highlands, intact, maintained automatically under standing enchantments. And a property in London, Broad Court, Covent Garden, currently leased to a wizarding family, lease renewable at heir discretion. Harry looked at the property list. What does heir decision mean for Godric's Hollow, he said. Repair, sell, or continue to hold. The decision is yours and requires only your confirmation. Hold it, Harry said, without hesitating. But I don't want to visit it yet. Ragnarok nodded and made a note, and the lack of any comment or question was itself a kind of respect. The Scottish property, Harry said. Is it habitable? Immediately. He looked at Amelia. She was already thinking through the implications, the guardianship papers, the Wisengamot hearing, the question of where Harry would live that was as yet formally unresolved. She and Augusta had filed the joint guardianship application but it hadn't been confirmed, and Harry was technically still a ward of the ministry, which meant any change of residence required. I'm not moving there now, he said, reading her expression with the accuracy that she was still not entirely accustomed to. I'm just finding out what I have. Wise, Ragnock said. Can I see the vault? Harry said. Ragnock closed the ledger. That is the traditional conclusion to an heir confirmation meeting, yes. The vault was on the second level, not as deep as the high-security vaults, but further than the standard deposit level, and the cart ride down made Harry grip the side rail with the white-knuckled focus of someone refusing to be visibly startled. When they stopped and the doors opened and the light caught the contents, he stood in the entrance and looked for a long moment. It wasn't excessive. It wasn't the obscene excess of old dark families who had spent centuries hoarding. It was comfortable and substantial and clearly belonged to people who had lived well and planned thoughtfully, and that was somehow more affecting than excess would have been, the evidence of people who had expected a future. There were also, against the left wall, 3 trunks. Old ones, locked, with the Potter crest. What's in those? Harry said. Personal effects, Ragnock said. Transferred here after Godric's Hollow was sealed. We were not instructed to open them. They are yours to open at your discretion. Harry walked to the nearest one, crouched in front of it, and looked at the lock. Amelia waited. He didn't open it. He put his hand on the lid, rested it there for a moment, and then stood up. Not today, he said quietly. She nodded. They returned to the surface, and Harry confirmed his heir status on a document that Ragnock sealed with goblin wax and filed with the precise satisfaction of someone completing something long overdue. At the door of the meeting room, Ragnock paused. Mr. Potter, he said. Harry turned. Gringotts has been the financial institution of the Potter family for 6 generations. The goblin's voice was entirely without sentiment, which somehow made it more weighty. It is good to have the heir confirmed. Harry looked at him for a moment. Thank you, he said, and he said it the way he said most things, directly, without the social cushioning that made thanks sound like courtesy rather than acknowledgement. Ragnock heard the difference. Amelia could tell. They walked out into Diagon Alley, and it was mid-morning and the alley was busy, and a witch near Madame Malkins glanced at Harry and then did a sharp double-take, and Harry clocked it with peripheral awareness but didn't break stride. That's going to happen a lot, he said. Not a complaint. Just an observation. Yes, she said. More after Friday. He considered this. The press. Rita Skeeter has already filed 3 requests for comment, she said. I've declined all of them. But after the verdict, whatever it is, the story becomes public. Your name, your location at Privet Drive, what was found. Some version of it. He was quiet for a moment. They'd stopped at the edge of the alley, near the entrance back to the Leaky Cauldron, and the morning crowd moved around them. What do you suggest, he said. I suggest, she said carefully, that you decide in advance how much of your story you're willing to own publicly, and you do it on your own terms before someone else does it for you. A controlled disclosure, 1 interview, 1 publication, your words. She paused. But only if you're ready. Which publication? The Quibbler, possibly. Luna Lovegood's father runs it. It's not the most widely read paper, but it's honest, which is rarer than it should be. She paused. Or the Prophet, with conditions. Those conditions would need to be ironclad and legally enforced. What conditions would you set, he said. Right of review before publication. No photographs without permission. No quotes attributed to you without direct confirmation. And nothing about the prophecy. He nodded slowly. The Quibbler, he said. It's smaller. Less overwhelming. He stopped, rephrased. I'd rather say my piece to a smaller audience and let it spread naturally than hand it to a big platform I can't control. She looked at him. That is genuinely the most media-sophisticated thing I have heard from someone who has never seen a newspaper with their name in it. The encyclopedia had a section on wizarding press law, he said. Of course it did. They walked back, and Harry was quiet in the particular way that meant his mind was working on something he hadn't articulated yet. She let it run. She had learned that interrupting Harry's thinking process produced shorter answers and slower conclusions. "The black secondary bequest," he said, when they were back in the ministry atrium. "Ragnarok said it was mine because of my grandmother. Who was a black before she married." "Yes. Doria Black, I believe. She married Charles Potter. So I have a connection to the Black family. A secondary one, yes." He looked at the atrium ceiling, at the fountain, at the morning witches and wizards moving through their days. "Sirius Black," he said. "He's in Azkaban." She went carefully still. "I read about the case," Harry said, turning to look at her. "In the charge files. He was my father's best friend, and he was accused of betraying my parents to Voldemort, and he killed 13 people and then went quietly when the Aurors arrived. He was given no trial." Where did you read that?" "The accession records in the legal archive. The librarian gave me access to the public-facing portion." He paused. "He was given no trial, Madam Bones." She looked at him, and the thing about Harry Potter was that when he looked at you, and there was no glancing away from it gracefully. "No," she said carefully. "He wasn't." "Is that legal?" Under the Emergency Powers Act passed during the height of Voldemort's war, immediate imprisonment without trial was permissible for anyone caught in flagrante of a crime with confirmed witnesses. She kept her voice factual. "The 13 Muggles who died in the blast, and Peter Pettigrew, Harry said, was the secret keeper. That's also in the records. The secret keeper was switched from Sirius Black to Peter Pettigrew a week before my parents died. That's in the Fidelius Charm Registry." She went very still. "Madam Bones," Harry said. "If Pettigrew was the secret keeper, he was the one who could have told Voldemort where my parents were. Not Sirius Black." The ministry atrium moved around them, unhurried and ordinary. Someone's memoplane fluttered past. 2 wizards argued quietly near the lift gates about something inconsequential. "That is a significant legal question," she said slowly. "It seems like it," Harry said. "Sirius Black is my godfather. I looked that up too." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because she needed to think about this clearly, and Harry was looking at her with that steady, unrelenting attention, and she needed to think about this clearly. "This is a separate matter from the current proceedings," she said finally. "I know. I'm not asking you to do anything about it right now." He looked at her directly. "But I'm asking you to file it. As a thing that needs to be looked at. Because if he's in there without a trial for something he didn't do, and I am a legal heir of the Black family, then," he stopped. "Is there a legal mechanism for requesting a review?" She had been the head of the DMLE for 6 years. She had files on hundreds of cases, and some of them she'd looked at and closed, and some she'd looked at and couldn't close, couldn't open, couldn't move. Sirius Black's case was in a drawer in her mind that she had not opened in 11 years because the war had been overwhelming and the evidence had seemed clear and Dumbledore had not raised a question about it and she had moved on. The evidence had seemed clear. "I'll file it," she said. "Not today. After Friday." He nodded. It was not an unsatisfied nod, it was the nod of someone who has set something in motion and trusts the mechanism. "Thank you." Back in the guest quarters, Susan was reading when they returned, and she looked up and clocked their expressions and said, "What happened?" "I'm apparently also a Black heir," Harry said, dropping into the chair across from her. "And my godfather is in Azkaban without a trial." Susan stared. "That's Sirius Black. The murderer." "Allegedly." She stared some more. Then she looked at Amelia. "Is that going in the thing on Friday?" "No," Amelia said. "It's a separate matter." "But it connects," Susan said, with the perceptive sharpness she deployed so casually that people sometimes forgot she was 11. "Doesn't it? If Dumbledore knew the secret keeper had been switched and didn't disclose that, don't run ahead of the evidence, Amelia said. Susan closed her mouth with the expression of someone who had run ahead and found what she expected but was being responsible about it. Harry had already picked up the resonance map and was looking at it again. He did this periodically, turning at different angles, examining sections of the fractal pattern with his head tilted. Amelia had begun to understand it was less study and more a kind of conversation with himself, the map as external representation of something internal that he was getting to know. "Can I start learning properly?" he said, without looking up. Structured magic. Wand work, theory, history. Not from books, with an actual teacher. "I have someone in mind," Amelia said. She had been thinking about this for days. Not Hogwarts, too early, too much exposure, and the hearing hadn't concluded. Not a ministry instructor, too formal, too entangled in the politics of the current proceedings. What Harry needed was someone with serious magical expertise, pedagogical skill, and the specific quality of not being intimidated by very unusual students. She sent an owl that afternoon to a retired Hogwarts professor named Bathsheba Babbling, who had taught ancient runes for 23 years and had a side practice in foundational magical theory that she ran out of a townhouse in Islington. Babbling was 70, rigorous, entirely unbothered by institutional politics, and had once, famously, made a sixth-year cry by pointing out a runic error in their work and then made the same student her best graduate by refusing to let them be comfortable with mediocrity. She was also, Amelia suspected, going to find Harry Potter the most interesting problem she'd had in decades. The reply came back within the hour, send him Thursday. 9 o'clock. Don't be late. Thursday morning, Harry walked into Babbling's Islington townhouse carrying his wand and his resonance map, and walked out 4 hours later looking like someone who had been running and found a second wind. He didn't talk much at first. He had the slightly stunned expression of someone who has had a number of long-held intuitions simultaneously confirmed and challenged, but by dinner he was talking about runic theory in relation to the recursive chord depth and Amelia had to request he use smaller words approximately twice. "She's good," he said, with the directness of an assessment rather than a compliment. "She is. She said I'm doing wordless magic intuitively because I learned to suppress the verbal impulse early, probably because speaking out loud during accidental magic incidents produced punishment, so I learned to run the magical intention through a different channel." He paused. "She said that's actually the more advanced technique and most wizards never develop it because they have no reason to." "She's right," Amelia said. "She's also going to make me learn the words anyway," he said. "So I understand what I'm doing, not just how to do it." He turned his fork in his hand. "She's going to test me on runic theory next week. Can I use the ministry archive? I'll get you a library pass." "Susan," from across the table, "I want to come to Babbling's." "It's not," Amelia started. "I'm starting Hogwarts in September," Susan said. "A month with someone who is actually good at magical theory would be an advantage, and you always say we should seek advantages." She paused. "And Harry works better when he has someone to talk at." Harry looked at her. "I don't, you spent 40 minutes last night explaining recursive magical cores to me." "Not to yourself. To me. You wanted someone to talk at." He considered this. "That's fair," he said. Amelia sent Babbling a second note that evening. Friday arrived. Harry was ready before anyone else, dressed in clean robes, wand holstered, hair making its usual brave and completely unsuccessful attempt at order. He ate breakfast systematically and without fuss and then sat with his hands flat on the table and did nothing for about 4 minutes, which was his version of what other people did with more visible nervous energy. Susan came in, assessed the situation, and sat across from him and put a pack of exploding snap cards on the table. He looked at the cards. "Do you know how to play?" she said. "No." "Good. I'll explain the rules and then beat you." She began dealing. "It'll pass the time and it's better than staring at the table." He picked up his cards, examined them with the focused attention he gave to everything, and said, "Do the ones that explode have a pattern or is it random?" She paused. I have never been asked that. Because if there's a pattern, Harry. It's a children's card game. Everything has patterns. She stared at him. You are going to be insufferable at Hogwarts. You keep saying that like it's a bad thing. She dealt the rest of the hand and was soundly beaten 3 times in 20 minutes, which she accepted with reasonably good grace, and by the time they needed to leave for the ministry courtroom, Harry had the color in his face that meant his mind was running and his hands were busy and he was, in the way available to him, fine. The courtroom was fuller than it had been on Wednesday. Word had spread, not press, not yet, but the Wisingamot community was small and information moved through it like magic through a conductor. There were witches and wizards in the gallery who had no formal stake in the proceedings and considerable personal interest, and the air had that particular quality of a room waiting to witness something. Dumbledore was there. Greenwald beside him, neat and composed. Dumbledore looked across the chamber at Harry, and Harry looked back, and the look between them was different now from what it had been on Monday, less adversarial, not warmer exactly, but more honest. Amelia stepped to the floor. She had prepared a closing argument and then discarded it and then written a different one and then discarded that too and eventually settled on something shorter and more specific than either, because the case was made and the evidence was entered and what the Wisingamot needed was not more argument. What they needed was to understand the single most important question in front of them. This proceeding, she said, will be remembered for one of 2 things. Either as the occasion on which this body established that no witch or wizard, regardless of status, history, or genuine good intention, stands above the laws that protect our most vulnerable. Or as the occasion on which we decided that certain people are simply too important for the law to apply. She looked around the chamber. Every one of you can name the violations. Every one of you has read the evidence. Every one of you knows, in the part of yourself that knew what was right before you knew what was political, that a child was failed. She paused. The question today is not whether Albus Dumbledore has done great things for the wizarding world. He has. The question is whether great things done elsewhere purchase the right to do wrong here. I believe, I know, that they do not. She sat down. Greenwald made his closing argument, careful, structured, historically contextualized, humanizing, and genuinely well-crafted. He was good at this. She acknowledged it privately. Dumbledore was asked if he wished to add anything. He stood. He looked around the chamber, and then at Harry. I do not dispute the findings, he said. I dispute only the framework in which those findings should be understood, and I acknowledge that even this dispute may ultimately be a function of my own refusal to see clearly. He paused. I made choices. Those choices had consequences I did not adequately consider. A child suffered for them. That is not something I can argue away, and I do not intend to try. He looked at Amelia. The law exists for a reason. Mrs. Bones has stated that reason more clearly than I could. He sat down. Augusta Longbottom, from her hereditary seat, said, "Vote." The vote took 11 minutes. Guilty on 47 of the 52 charges, the 5 administrative violations, the ones about filing failures and procedural skips, were dismissed on grounds that they fell under wartime emergency provisions that had since lapsed. The other 47 stood. The sentencing discussion took longer. There were arguments, passionate ones on both sides, and Fudge made an impassioned if not entirely coherent speech about the importance of Dumbledore's continued involvement in the wizarding world, and 2 members voted for Azkaban on the more serious counts, and in the end the Wisingamot arrived at something that felt, to Amelia, less like a verdict and more like a reckoning. Dumbledore was removed from the position of Chief Warlock of the Wisingamot, effective immediately. He retained his role as Hogwarts headmaster, but with a mandatory oversight board reviewing every decision relating to student welfare. He was fined, significantly, the number with enough zeros that even Greenwald had to pause, with all proceeds directed to a newly established magical child welfare fund. He was placed on a 5-year conditional probation during which his guardianship authority over any magical minor was suspended. And a new position was created within the DMLE, Child Welfare and Magical Placement Oversight Officer, with full independent authority to audit any magical placement from Supreme Mugwump level down. Amelia had not proposed that last one. Augusta Longbottom had, on Thursday evening, in a memo that had arrived on Amelia's desk with the force of something inevitable. The chamber absorbed the verdict. There was noise, there was always noise, in a room full of people who had opinions, but under the noise was something quieter and more significant. The specific sound of an institution beginning, reluctantly, to know itself. Harry was still in his seat when the chamber began to empty. Susan was next to him, quiet for once. He was looking at the chair where Dumbledore had been sitting, which was empty now. Dumbledore had left with Greenwald without looking back, which was either dignity or grief or both. "How do you feel?" Susan asked him. He thought about it. Actually thought, not reflexively answered. "Like it's the right outcome," he said. "But not satisfying. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said. "Because he's not," he stopped. Started again. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. And some of it was the right thing. The protection, the blood ward, keeping Voldemort away, those were real. "I'm alive because of him." He turned his wand in his hand. But being alive isn't the same as having a life. And he didn't seem to know the difference. Susan looked at him for a moment. "That's really sad." "Yeah," he said. "It is." Amelia came to them, and they left the courtroom together, through the corridors and back up to the atrium, and in the atrium Harry stopped and turned back and looked at the corridor that led down to the courtrooms, and there was something in his face that she couldn't entirely classify, something that was letting go of a thing he'd been carrying for longer than he'd had words for it. Then he turned back, and his expression settled, and he looked at her. "The joint guardianship application," he said. "Yours and Augusta's. Confirmed this morning," she said. "Before the hearing. It was formally processed." She paused. "If you agree to it." She had meant to bring this up in a more considered way, with documents, with explanations, with the proper formality it deserved. But Harry had asked directly, which meant he'd been thinking about it, which meant this was the moment. "I agree," he said. Not after a long pause or with elaborate consideration. With the same certainty he'd brought to everything else. "Yes. You might want to. I thought about it," he said. "I've been thinking about it since you mentioned Augusta at dinner last week. 2 houses, 2 families, people who are already doing this because they chose to, not because a letter showed up on their doorstep." He looked at her. "Yes." She nodded. "Can I meet Sirius Black?" he said. The atrium was busy around them, the afternoon ministry traffic flowing past, and Amelia stood in the middle of it and thought about 47 guilty verdicts and a 5-year probation and a newly created oversight position and a 9-year-old boy who had just agreed to a legal family and was immediately looking at the next thing that needed fixing. "I'll look into it," she said. "That's not a no," he said. "It's not a no," she confirmed. He turned to Susan. "Ice cream?" "Absolutely," Susan said. "You just survived a Wisengamot hearing. We're definitely getting ice cream." "I didn't do anything," he said. "I just sat there." "You read a ministry encyclopedia in one night, found a ward magic loophole that collapsed the opposing expert's argument, went to Gringotts and confirmed an heir status, identified a potential wrongful imprisonment, and agreed to a joint guardianship by age 9. She pointed her finger at him. "You did things. Take the ice cream." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that preceded the real smile, the one that was still relatively new and genuinely his. "Okay," he said. "Ice cream." They went, the 3 of them, out through the telephone box entrance and into the London afternoon, and the wizarding world was 6 months away from knowing his name, and Harry Potter was walking toward it with his wand on his wrist and his eyes open and nothing behind him worth looking back at. Chapter 5. Fires in the institution. November came in cold and fast, and Harry had been living between Bones Manor and Longbottom House for 3 weeks when the prophet ran the story. It wasn't Rita Skeeter. Amelia had managed that much. Skeeter had been outmaneuvered by the simple expedient of giving the story to someone else first, a junior reporter at the Quibbler named Barnabas Cuff who had recently defected from the Prophet and still had enough old-school journalistic instinct to print what people actually said rather than what made the best headline. The article ran on a Tuesday. It was measured, factual, and devastating in the way that facts presented clearly and without embellishment tended to be devastating. It covered the charge sheet, the hearing, the verdict, and Harry's removal from Privet Drive in the specific, undramatic language of someone who trusted the facts to do the work. The response was not measured. By Wednesday morning, Amelia had received 432 owls. Harry had received, redirected to the ministry because his personal address was not public, approximately 1,200. The Wisingamot clerk's office had received 63 formal complaints about the verdict, 41 letters of support, and one howler addressed to Cornelius Fudge that had to be detonated in a containment box. Dumbledore's supporters, and there were many, because there always were for extraordinary men whose greatness was real even when their choices were wrong, wrote letters in the Prophet that ranged from thoughtful disagreement to barely veiled outrage. Several prominent wizarding families issued formal statements expressing concern about the precedent. 2 members of the Wisingamot who had voted guilty quietly indicated to various people that they were reconsidering their position, which was legally meaningless but politically significant. Dumbledore's critics, and there were also many of those, because institutions that had been managed by one person's certainty for decades tended to accumulate frustrated observers, wrote letters that were in some cases more unsettling than the supportive ones, calling for harsher punishment, broader investigation, the dissolution of the Hogwarts oversight structure entirely. Harry read all of it. Not compulsively, he didn't seek it out, but Amelia had established early that trying to keep things from him was both ineffective and counterproductive, and so she gave him access to the press coverage with the understanding that he would form his own views and not be destabilized by other people's. He was not destabilized. He was, if anything, more focused. He'd been at Babblings every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 weeks, and what he was doing there had moved beyond foundational theory into something that Babbling described, in a letter to Amelia that managed to be both excited and slightly alarmed, as accelerated spontaneous integration. He's not learning spells, Amelia, he's learning how spells work at the architectural level, and then producing working versions of things that shouldn't be accessible to an untrained 9-year-old, and I want you to know I am not worried about this. I am deeply interested in it, but you should perhaps be aware. On Thursday of the 2nd week of November, Harry was at Babblings when the first stone came through the window of Bones Manor. It wasn't magical, that was the thing. It was a very muggle rock, about the size of a fist, with a note tied to it that read Dumbledore should have let the boy die like his parents in block letters. The window in question was in the ground floor sitting room, and it had shattered inward and covered the sofa in glass, and Susan had been sitting on that sofa 20 minutes earlier before going upstairs to find a book. She came down to the sound of broken glass and found the rock and stood looking at it with her jaw tight and her wand in her hand, and by the time she'd flooded the ministry and Amelia had arrived and the DMLE officers had secured the perimeter, the initial shock had hardened into something cooler. "They're angry at me," Susan said, when Amelia came in. "They're angry at the situation," Amelia said. "You're visible and that makes you a target." It was supposed to be for Harry. Harry's address isn't public. Susan looked at the rock, still lying in the middle of the glass-covered floor. "He'll want to know about this. I'll tell him. Tell him I'm fine. I will." She went back to the ministry, and Harry was already back from Babblings and in the library with the door open, working through a text on ancient runes that was technically a 6th-year level resource, and he looked up when she came in and read her expression in one pass. "What happened?" he said. She told him plainly. He listened without interruption, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Is Susan all right?" "Uninjured. Shaken, but she's handling it. I want to go to the manor." "Harry, she's my friend," he said, "and someone threw a rock at her window because of me. I want to go." He said it with the same tone he said most things, not asking, not demanding, just stating the position with the clarity of someone who had already decided and was informing rather than requesting. She had been the head of a law enforcement department for 6 years and she knew the difference between a child having a reaction and a person making a decision, and Harry Potter made decisions. They went. He sat with Susan in the kitchen for 2 hours, and Susan talked, about the rock, about the letters she'd been reading over Amelia's shoulder, about a girl at her primary school who had called her a freak for knowing things, and Harry listened and occasionally said something precise and dry that made her laugh unexpectedly, and by the time they left Susan was herself again, or near enough. In the car back to the ministry, Amelia used a car occasionally, because London apparition in peak hours was more trouble than it was worth. Harry looked out the window at the dark November streets and said, "They're afraid." "Yes," she said. "Because if Dumbledore was wrong, then everything he told them about being safe is wrong." Something like that. "That's not actually about me," he said. "That's about them needing to believe someone is managing things." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Voldemort isn't gone," he said. "No. They know that. Most of them know that." He turned from the window. "So the real fear is that the person they thought was handling the Voldemort problem has been compromised, and there's nobody they trust to replace him." He paused. "And I'm a 9-year-old who makes the scanner break, which is either reassuring or terrifying depending on how you look at it." "How do you look at it?" she said. "Like a problem to be solved before it needs to be solved," he said. "I have, 8 years? Until Voldemort is strong enough to actually be a problem?" "Roughly. Then I have 8 years to become someone who can deal with it." "That's plenty of time." He said it without drama, without the weight that the statement perhaps deserved. Just planning. The same way he'd approached the ward magic, the Gringotts confirmation, the charge sheet. Here is a problem. Here is time and resource. Let's think. She kept her eyes on the road and privately felt something she could only describe as vicarious relief, not at the situation, but at the quality of the person the situation had produced despite its best efforts. The Hogwarts Oversight Board had its first meeting on the same Thursday as the broken window, which was a coincidence that Amelia found cosmically impertinent. She wasn't on the board, that would have been a conflict given the current proceedings, but Augusta Longbottom was, along with 3 other Wisengamot members, a representative from the ICW, and a Muggle-born educational specialist named Thaddeus Bramble who had been recommended by the Department of Magical Education and whom everyone had underestimated until he walked into the first meeting and systematically dismantled 5 of Hogwarts' existing student welfare policies in the first 30 minutes using only their own documentation. Augusta's report afterward was delivered to Amelia over breakfast at the Manor on Friday morning, with Neville eating toast at the other end of the table and Harry across from Amelia, and Augusta's account of Bramble's systematic policy demolition made Harry put his fork down and listen. He found non-compliance with the Welfare Act in the dormitory assignment process, Augusta said. Students with documented trauma history being placed in high-conflict dormitory arrangements. Also in the detention system, physical labor without appropriate safety charms, and in the Quidditch selection process, which apparently prioritizes the desires of certain house heads over documented student aptitude. Which house heads? Harry said. Augusta glanced at him over her teacup. That's a more specific question than most adults would ask. Which house heads? He said again, patient. Slytherin primarily, she said. Snape favors his own students to a degree that constitutes documented bias. She paused. Dumbledore is aware of it and has historically considered it an acceptable trade-off for Snape's loyalty and expertise. Harry was quiet for a moment. Snape will be my teacher. Potions, yes. When you attend. He processed this. And Dumbledore kept him despite the bias because of something else he provides. That's what it looks like, Augusta said. What does Snape provide that's worth that? Augusta and Amelia exchanged a look, and Harry caught it with the peripheral accuracy that meant the look had been filed. Information, Amelia said carefully. There are things I can't tell you yet because they involve an ongoing investigation. She met his eyes. When I can, I will. He nodded. He didn't push it. That was another quality she'd come to rely on. He knew when something was being withheld for reasons rather than reasons pointed at him, and he accepted it without the affront that most people brought to incomplete information. Neville, from the end of the table, said, "Are you worried about going to Hogwarts?" Everyone looked at him. He looked mildly startled by having said it out loud, but held his ground. Harry thought about it. "Not worried," he said. "Thinking about it. There are things at Hogwarts that need to be different before I get there." He paused. "Some of them the board is already addressing. Some of them," he looked at Augusta. "Has anyone looked at the data position? The curse on it?" Augusta set her teacup down. "The curse that prevents teachers from staying longer than a year. Presumably Dumbledore knows about it," Harry said. "He's been headmaster long enough to have seen the pattern. If he hasn't addressed it, that's a choice." "It's widely attributed to Voldemort," Augusta said. "A curse placed on the position after Dumbledore refused him the job. So Dumbledore knows the position is compromised and hasn't found a way to fix it in 30 years, Harry said. "And every year, students get a different defense teacher, most of them inadequate. That's a significant structural problem. It's also," Augusta said, looking at him, "not easily solved." "Nothing useful is easily solved," Harry said, and picked his fork back up with the ease of someone who had just stated something obvious. Neville looked at him with the expression he sometimes got, a kind of wondering recognition, and then went back to his toast. The week between the article and the next major development had the peculiar energy of a held breath. The DMLE received an increasingly organized set of pro-Dumbledore correspondence that suggested coordination rather than spontaneous public feeling, and Amelia had Proudfoot, her best investigative officer, a compact, sharp-eyed witch who had solved 11 cases in 4 years, quietly traced the origin of the letter campaign. What Proudfoot found was not entirely surprising but was significantly annoying: 3 prominent wizarding families, coordinating through a solicitor's office, pushing a petition to the ICW to review the Wisingamot verdict on grounds that it violated the Supreme Mugwump's discretionary authority. "They're going to take it international," Proudfoot said, dropping the report on Amelia's desk. "Can they?" Amelia said. "The ICW petition process is technically available to any signatory family. The Malfoys, the Knotts, and the Parkinsons have all signed." She paused. "Lucius Malfoy wrote the petition personally." Amelia looked at the report for a moment. "Malfoy," she said. "Yes. The thing is," Proudfoot hesitated. "The petition has a point, legally. Not a good one, but a real one. The Supreme Mugwump's discretionary authority does extend to emergency placements. Greenwald's team found that, and Malfoy's solicitor is building on it. They're not doing this for Dumbledore," Amelia said. "No. They're doing it to establish the precedent that discretionary authority overrides welfare law. Which helps them for entirely different reasons." Proudfoot's expression was the expression of someone who found this sort of thing professionally offensive. Specifically, it would retroactively legalize about a dozen similar situations involving families who made irregular guardianship arrangements for children they wanted controlled rather than protected. Amelia looked at the Malfoy name on the document. "Set up a monitoring brief on the Malfoy correspondence," she said. "Discreet. Full intercept authority under the emergency surveillance provisions." She paused. "And find me everything we have on Lucius Malfoy's Death Eater affiliations." "We have quite a lot," Proudfoot said. "Most of it's been sitting in a file marked insufficient evidence for 6 years." "Revisit the evidence threshold," Amelia said. Proudfoot smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone being given permission to do something they'd wanted to do for a long time. "Yes, Madam Bones." She told Harry about the ICW petition that evening, because she told him about things that affected him, which was increasingly the operating principle of their relationship. He listened and asked 3 questions, each more precise than the last, and then said, "Malfoy didn't like the verdict because it's about discretionary authority. Yes. Not because he's particularly loyal to Dumbledore. Correct. So he's using Dumbledore's situation to establish a broader legal cover. He thought about it. That's smart. In a specific and unpleasant way. It is. What do you need to stop it? Evidence that the petition is being filed in bad faith, that its true purpose is to establish personal legal cover rather than to correct a miscarriage of justice. And if Malfoy was a Death Eater, that establishes the bad faith, Harry said. If we can prove it, yes. He nodded slowly. What's the timeline on the petition? ICW review typically takes 60 to 90 days to open a formal inquiry. So we have 2 months. Roughly. He was quiet for a long moment. Can I help? The evidence piece, is there something I can do? The archive access, you're 9 years old, she said. I'm the subject of the original case, he said. I have legal standing in any related proceedings. The encyclopedia, Harry. He looked at her. Yes, she said. You have legal standing. But you are also 9 years old and you have been dealing with courts and charges and hearings for 3 weeks, and there is a difference between being capable of helping and it being appropriate for you to help. She held his gaze. The Malfoy situation is mine. Let me carry it. He held the look for a moment, and she waited for the push, the redirect, the logical counterargument. It didn't come. Instead, something shifted in his expression, something quiet and not unhappy. Okay, he said. It was the most straightforward concession she'd heard from him, and it told her something. He trusted her enough to let go of a thing he wanted to hold. She filed that alongside the other things she was collecting, observations about Harry Potter that didn't belong in any official report but that she found herself carrying anyway. Babbling's report at the end of the 3rd week was delivered in person, which was unusual enough that Amelia cleared her afternoon. The retired professor arrived in Amelia's office and sat down without being invited and put a stack of parchment on the desk with the energy of someone delivering evidence. He's doing something I've never seen, Babbling said. Accelerated integration, you said in your letter, beyond that. Look at this. She pulled the top sheet off the stack. It was covered in runic notation, dense and precise. He wrote this last Thursday. It's a theoretical framework for what he's calling layered intent casting, using the recursive depth in his core to run multiple magical intentions simultaneously through a single wand movement. She looked at Amelia over the top of the parchment. This is original theory, Amelia. This is not a 9-year-old extrapolating from textbooks. This is someone generating new magical theory. Can it be tested? I tested it, Babbling said. Or rather, I had him demonstrate it. She paused. He cast 4 spells simultaneously. Different intentions, different magical classes. One was a shield charm, one was a light-based offensive hex, one was a diagnostic charm, and one was a heating charm for his tea. Simultaneously. Wand work looked like a single casting to anyone who didn't know to look for the layering. She sat back. Adult battle mages train for years to achieve 2 simultaneous castings. The record in the professional dueling circuit is 3, and it was held by a Lebanese wizard who trained for a decade. And Harry didn't train for it at all. He just did it. Because his theory said it should work and he tried it. Babbling looked at the parchment stack. I want you to understand the implications here. He's not just powerful in the large output sense. He's powerful in the architectural sense. He understands magic at a level that allows him to modify how it works. For himself, at least. Possibly more broadly. She paused. He's also being very careful. Careful how? He's not telling me the full extent of what he can do, Babbling said. Not deceptively, he's not hiding it maliciously. I think he's being careful because he's not sure yet how people respond to it, and he's gathering information before he commits to full disclosure. She looked at Amelia. Which is very sensible behavior that I absolutely cannot fault, and I want you to know I understand why he does it, but I wanted you to know. Amelia thought about this. Has he told Susan? Babbling paused. Some of it, I think. She started coming to sessions last week and they work through things together in the evenings. She's good for him, she normalizes it. He'll explain something extraordinary and she'll respond as if it's interesting rather than alarming, and that seems to be the register he needs. She looked at the stack of parchment. What does he need that he doesn't have, she said. Babbling thought about it seriously. Opponents, she said. He needs to work against people who push back. Not in a combat sense, in a magical theory sense. He's hitting the ceiling of what I can challenge him with, and that's not a reflection of my limitations so much as the specific nature of what he's doing. He needs people who work at the frontier of magical theory and will argue with him. She paused. I have colleagues at the Department of Mysteries who would find him astonishing. He's 9 years old. I know. But the work he's producing isn't 9 years old. Babbling gathered the parchment. Think about it. She thought about it through the rest of November, through the build-up of the Malfoy petition and the ongoing press coverage and the steady accumulation of Harry's weeks at Babblings and the Manor and the Longbottom greenhouse and the Ministry library. She thought about it while watching him at dinner, turning ideas over in conversation with the focused pleasure of someone who had found the thing they were made for and was simply running at it. She thought about it watching him with Neville, the easy friendship that had settled between them, practical and warm, Neville's plant knowledge feeding Harry's structural interest in how magical organisms worked, Harry's theoretical rigor pushing Neville's intuitive herbology into more conscious territory. She thought about it watching him with Susan, who had appointed herself a kind of social interpreter for the wider wizarding world, and who did it with such cheerful competence that Harry had begun to genuinely rely on her for readings of social situations he found opaque. The Department of Mysteries could wait. He was 9. There was time. The second stone came through a window at Longbottom House 2 weeks after the first one at Bones Manor, and this time it was magical, a hex that shattered the glass inward and left a residue that activated like a delayed alarm, so that anyone who touched the glass fragments would receive a significant shock. Augusta Longbottom found it, managed it with the efficiency of a woman who had survived a war, and had the glass neutralized before anyone else came into contact with it. She also had Proudfoot's monitoring team trace the hex's magical signature within 4 hours. The signature belonged to a wizard named Avery. Amelia knew the name. He was on a list she kept in a locked drawer, a list that had not gotten shorter in 11 years. Death Eater. Known affiliate. Insufficient evidence for prosecution, the same designation that covered Lucius Malfoy and a dozen others who had claimed Imperius Curse after Voldemort's fall. She escalated the monitoring brief and added 3 more names to it, and she had a very quiet, very pointed conversation with Proudfoot about evidence thresholds and the specific legal provisions for endangerment of a minor. Harry was told about the second attack the same evening. He was at the manor, and he listened to the account without visible reaction, and then he said, "They're escalating." Yes. Why? The verdict is handed down. The petition is already filed. Escalating against the witnesses doesn't change the legal position. It changes the pressure on me, she said. If the people around you are in danger, there's an argument for removing you from this context. Placing you somewhere more secure and more isolated. She paused. It's a familiar strategy. He looked at her, and something sharpened in his face. They want me isolated. Some of them do. Not for Dumbledore's reasons, for their own. He was quiet for a moment. Then, who? The Malfoy group? Possibly. We're still tracing the signature. Because if I'm isolated and controlled, Harry said slowly, following the logic with the focus she'd come to recognize as his operational mode, then I'm a resource rather than a person. Same as before. He looked at his wand. That's what they're trying to restore. Not Dumbledore's position. The general principle that I can be managed. Yes, she said. That's very precisely what's happening. Then we shouldn't let them think it's working, he said. What do you mean? He looked at her directly. I've been mostly invisible. Staying in, keeping low, working with babbling, reading. Which is what I need to be doing, I know that. But they're escalating because they're guessing that I'm manageable. That I can be frightened back into a small space. He paused. What would make them recalibrate? She looked at him for a moment. Visibility, she said slowly. Specifically what kind? She thought about it, and as she thought about it, something came together, an idea she'd been carrying in pieces that suddenly had a shape. Quibbler interview, she said. Not about the case. Not about Dumbledore. About you. Who you are, what you're doing, what you think. In your own words. She paused. Not a frightened child in hiding. Not a symbol being managed. Just, Harry. He considered it. You said the Quibbler first. Smaller audience. The situation has changed. The story is already out. The Quibbler piece would be reprinted everywhere within a day, it's that kind of story. She met his eyes. The question is whether you're ready. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the November dark was solid and complete, the manor garden invisible except where the security charms occasionally pulsed faint blue at the perimeter. Can I read what they write before it goes out? He said. Guaranteed, or we don't participate. And nothing about the prophecy. Nothing about the prophecy. He nodded slowly. What do I say? Exactly what you think, she said. Nothing more and nothing less. The interview happened on a Saturday morning in early December, and the journalist, not Cuff this time, but a witch named Marlowe who had been writing serious pieces for the Quibbler for 15 years and had the particular quality of asking questions and then actually listening to the answers, arrived at the ministry with a quick quotes quill that Harry looked at, picked up, and set aside. I prefer you write by hand, he said. Marlowe looked at him. Then she put the quick quotes quill in her bag and took out a regular quill, and the quality of the interview that followed was significantly better for it. Harry talked for 2 hours. He talked about Privet Drive in the way he talked about most things, factually, without self-pity, without performing either suffering or resilience. He talked about what it felt like to find out magic was real when he'd been punished for it for years. He talked about the Gringotts' visit and what it felt like to put his hand on a trunk that held his parents' things. He talked about Neville and the Mimbulus Mimbletonia. He talked about babbling and what it was like to learn that magic had architecture. He talked about Dumbledore with the same careful honesty he'd brought to everything else, acknowledging the complexity without either excusing the harm or denying the genuine care behind the wrong choices. He thought he was doing what needed to be done, Harry said. He was also wrong. Both of those things are true at the same time, and that's not actually confusing, it's just how people work. He paused. I'm more interested in what happens now than in what happened before. What do you think happens now? Marlowe asked. Harry considered the question with the attention it deserved. The wizarding world has been operating on the assumption that one person, someone brilliant, someone with good intentions, could manage its biggest problems privately, he said. And for a while that probably worked, or seemed to. But privately managed problems don't actually get solved. They just get held. He looked at her steadily. I think things need to be less managed and more fixed. And I think that takes a lot of people, not one person. Including people who've been kept out of the conversation. He paused. Including me. You're 9 years old, Marlowe said. I know, Harry said. But I'm also the person this was all about. I think that gives me something to say. She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something down. The article ran the following Wednesday, and by Thursday it had been reprinted in the Prophet, the Irish Magical Times, and 2 European wizarding publications. By Friday it had been translated into French and German. The ministry owls came in at a rate that required 3 post-rooms to handle. Not all positive, some furious, some frightened, some the specific bewildered outrage of people who had expected a certain kind of child and found a different kind entirely. But also, a significant number of letters from Muggle-born witches and wizards who had felt managed and overlooked for years and who said, in various ways, that a 9-year-old had just articulated something they hadn't had the language for. Letters from families who had made irregular guardianship choices that had been swept under institutional carpets. Letters from people who had doubted the verdict on Dumbledore and now weren't so sure. One letter came from a solicitor's office in Edinburgh representing 6 families with children currently in irregular magical placements, requesting information about the new DMLE child welfare officer position. One came from Hogwarts, signed by 7 students in years 4 through 6, who said they were glad someone had talked about Snape. And one came, handwritten on plain parchment in a script she didn't immediately recognize, with a Hogwarts postmark. Mr. Potter, I don't imagine you have any reason to think well of me, and I don't ask you to. But the thing you said about privately managed problems only being held and not solved, I have been thinking about that since yesterday. I believe it is correct. I intend to think about it further. She gave it to Harry. He read it, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He's listening, he said. It seems like, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in his expression, not quite satisfied, not quite peaceful, but the particular quiet of someone who has done something they can't undo and has decided that's exactly right. Good, he said. The Avery trace came back at the end of the first week of December, and it came back with more than she'd asked for. The hex on the Longbottom window had been cast by Avery, yes, but it had been organized by a group, for names, all on her list, all with the same insufficient evidence tag. And the meeting that organized it had been held at a location that Proudfoot had tracked through a chain of magical residue evidence to a property in Wiltshire that was registered to the Malfoy family. The Malfoys. Again. She looked at the report for a long time, and then she looked at the list in her locked drawer, and then she did something she'd been wanting to do for years and had been waiting for the right fulcrum. She opened a full investigation into Lucius Malfoy's post-war Death Eater activity, with full surveillance authority, full evidence collection protocols, and the specific charge of coordinated endangerment of a ministry-protected minor. Proudfoot, receiving the authorization, looked like someone who'd been handed an early Christmas present. Harry was at the manor that evening, working with Susan through a problem in advanced runic theory that babbling had set them both, though Susan's involvement was more along the lines of asking sharp questions that clarified Harry's thinking than engaging with the runic notation itself, which she freely admitted she found less interesting than he did. He looked up when Amelia came in with a face she knew he'd read. Something happened, he said. Progress on the second attack, she said. That's all I can tell you for now. He looked at her for a moment. The Malfoy connection, he said. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She looked at him with the specific look she developed for situations where Harry had arrived at the correct answer by reasoning she couldn't technically have facilitated. He nodded slowly. So it's moving, he said. It's moving. He looked back at his runic work. Then let's not worry about it tonight, he said, and turned a page. Susan caught Amelia's eye across the table and held it for a moment, with the expression of someone who had something to say but was choosing the better impulse. Then she pointed at a section of Harry's notes and said something about the third runic sequence, and Harry's attention went back to the page, and Amelia sat down at the end of the table with a cup of tea and the Malfoy investigation file and the particular domestic quiet of an evening that was ordinary and safe and hard won. She thought, we are not finished. The ICW petition was running. Malfoy was active. Voldemort was somewhere, incomplete and patient. The scar on Harry's forehead had dark magic in it that Pomfrey couldn't assess and nobody had fully examined, and that was a problem for another day that was coming faster than she'd like. She thought, but we are not where we were. And the distance between there and here was significant. Harry reached the end of a page, turned it, and frowned thoughtfully at the next section of notation. Madam Bones, he said, without looking up. Yes. This runic sequence, the fourth clause, it only works if the intent layering is pre-established before the casting. He tapped the page. But Babbling's notation implies you establish it during. That can't be right. She looked at the notation. She had competent runic theory from her own Hogwarts years, thoroughly overmatched by what Harry was doing but sufficient to check the basics. Show me, she said. He turned the notebook toward her and walked her through it, and Susan leaned over to look as well, and outside the manor windows December dark pressed against the glass, and somewhere in London the Amelia building held 3 active investigations and a list in a locked drawer that was about to get shorter. And in a 9-year-old's notation, precise and original and building towards something she couldn't fully see yet, the architecture of a future was taking shape. Chapter 6. After the verdict December moved the way December always did in Britain, in grey increments, the days shortening to a point where the dark felt structural rather than temporary, like the world had decided on a different set of proportions and intended to keep them. Harry had been at Bones Manor for 6 weeks when he stopped being a guest. It wasn't marked by ceremony. It happened the way most real things happened, quietly, through accumulation. He had a shelf in the library that was his. He had a mug that Susan had designated his mug with the particular authority she brought to domestic arrangements, and which lived in a specific spot on the kitchen shelf. He knew where Amelia kept the spare keys to the DMLE archive, and she knew he knew, and neither of them had commented on it. He had learned to navigate the house at night without waking anyone, which was a habit from Privet Drive that he hadn't been able to shake, but now it ended in the kitchen with a book and a glass of water rather than in a cupboard under a staircase. It ended with belonging, which was a new skill he was still developing. The morning of December 12th, Amelia came down to find Harry already at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea made, one for her, the right temperature, the right amount of milk, because he'd been watching how she took it for 6 weeks and had simply started making it that way. She sat down and picked up the mug and looked at him over the rim of it and didn't say anything, because she didn't need to. He was reading the morning's Prophet, which had continued its complicated relationship with the story, some days running pieces that supported the Wisingamot verdict, some days running opinion columns that worried about precedent and institutional stability and whether the wizarding world had been too hasty, as if 47 guilty counts and a scanner that couldn't find his ceiling required rushing into. Skeeter, he said, without looking up, and slid the paper across to her. The headline, Boy Who Lived or Boy Who Lied? Questions arise about Potter's account. She read it. It was the particular Skeeter special, not a direct lie, technically, more a constellation of implications and carefully sourced anonymous quotes arranged to produce a conclusion she decided on before she started writing. This one suggested that Harry's account of his Privet Drive years had been shaped by ambitious adults with political agendas, and that a 9-year-old couldn't be expected to accurately characterize his own upbringing, and that perhaps the Dursleys' perspective deserved more consideration. She folded it and set it down. Skeeter has been trying to get to Petunia Dursley for 2 weeks, she said. Vernon Dursley told her to go away in terms that apparently impressed even Skeeter. Harry looked at the folded paper. She's going to keep it this. Yes. Is there anything I can do about it legally? Possibly. The DMLE has been building a file on Skeeter for different reasons. Amelia picked up her tea. She's an unregistered animagus. Harry looked up at her. A beetle, she said. We've suspected it for 3 years and haven't been able to confirm. But it would explain how she gets information from closed rooms. Harry thought about this for a moment. If she's unregistered, any information she gathered in animagus form is inadmissible and any story based on it is legally compromised. Yes. So you need confirmation. We need confirmation. He looked at his tea. I'll think about it, he said, in the tone that meant he was already thinking about it and the statement was really a notification. Susan appeared at the kitchen door in dressing gown and deeply committed morning hair, assessed the situation, poured herself tea, looked at the folded Prophet and said, Skeeter again? Yes, Harry said. She wrote that piece about my aunt last month calling her politically motivated, Susan said. Aunt Amelia made a face at it and then filed something. She sat down. She always files something. It's very satisfying to watch. I was noting it for future reference, Amelia said. Same thing, Susan said. Harry almost smiled. It was the kind of morning that had become ordinary enough to be remarkable: 3 people in a kitchen, tea made correctly, the particular texture of a shared domestic life that had built itself from nothing over 6 weeks. He was careful not to hold it too tightly, which was a habit from having things taken, but he noticed it. He was learning to notice things without bracing. The formal joint guardianship ceremony, such as it was, happened that afternoon. It was not supposed to be a ceremony. It was supposed to be a document signing in Amelia's ministry office with Augusta present and a Wisengamot registrar confirming the paperwork. Augusta arrived with Neville, who had insisted on coming and was holding the Mimbulus Mimbletonia with the specific care he reserved for important occasions. Susan had somehow produced a small iced cake from Madame Pudafoots, which she set on the corner of the desk with the expression of someone who considers iced cake a basic requirement for significant events. The registrar, a small, methodical wizard named Puckle, looked at the cake, at Neville's plant, at Harry, and then at his documents, and proceeded with the professional neutrality of a man who had processed a great many unusual guardianship arrangements and had decided long ago that neutral was the correct register for all of them. Harry signed the documents. His handwriting was precise and slightly old-fashioned, learned from books rather than instruction. The quill went across the parchment with the same intentional quality everything he did had, and when his name was fully down, Harry James Potter, Puckle pressed the Wisengamot seal to it and it glowed briefly gold and then settled, and that was that. Legally confirmed, Puckle said. Augusta looked at Harry from across the desk with the Winterflint eyes. She didn't say anything warm, because that wasn't how she communicated warmth. She said, "You will have dinner at Longbottom House every Sunday." Non-negotiable. "Yes," Harry said. "And you will attend Neville's greenhouse sessions when he requests it. He finds them more productive with company." "I find them interesting," Harry said, which was true. The magical botany work he'd been doing with Neville had taken on its own shape, separate from the runic theory and separate from the broader magical architecture work he did with babbling. Plants grew their magic structurally, the way he'd said to Amelia back in October, and working with Neville through that structural growth had given him ideas about magical development that he hadn't been able to generate from theory alone. "Good," Augusta said. She picked up her gloves. Then, in the specific tone she used for the things that mattered most to her, which was a tone so controlled it was nearly indistinguishable from her administrative voice, "Welcome to the family, Harry." He looked at her. He held the look for a moment, and something moved in his face, that fast, young, real thing he sometimes let through before the control reasserted. "Thank you," he said. Neville, who had been watching this exchange with careful attention, said, "Cake now." "Cake now," Susan confirmed, and cut it with the decisiveness of someone who had been patient long enough. The serious black question arrived 3 days later, in a form Amelia had not anticipated. She'd been working through the procedural channels for requesting a case review, a slow process, deliberately slow, because Azkaban case reviews required sign-off from 3 departments and a Wisengamot majority vote, and the Wisengamot was still processing the energy of the Dumbledore verdict and wasn't rushing into new territory, when a letter arrived from Azkaban itself. Not from the prison administration. From Sirius Black. It was written on paper so thin it was nearly translucent, in handwriting that had the quality of someone who had been writing in confined spaces with inadequate tools for a long time, not shaky, but compressed, as if he'd been conserving both space and energy. "I read about the boy in the paper. I heard about the case through the prison system, news travels even here, eventually. I know you're the one who removed him from Privet Drive. I am his godfather. I was his father's best friend. I did not betray James and Lily. I know what the evidence looks like. I also know what actually happened, and I know who Pettigrew is, and I know where he is, and I can prove it if anyone is willing to listen. I'm not asking for release. I'm asking for a conversation." Sirius Black. She read it 4 times. Then she went to Harry. He was in the library, at his shelf, with a text on spell architecture that babbling had sourced from a Belgian magical academy, which was the level of resource he'd hit the ceiling of domestically. He read it the way he read everything, fully present, no part of his attention anywhere else, and looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it. Then he read it again, more slowly. Pettigrew, he said. He says he knows where Pettigrew is. Yes. And that he can prove it. Yes. Harry set the letter on the desk beside his book and looked at it. He's been in there 11 years, he said. Yes. Without a trial. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was entirely steady, but there was something underneath it that was younger and more immediate than his usual register. Can we go see him? It's not simple, she said. Azkaban visitation requires. You're the head of the DMLE, he said, not rudely, just pointing at a fact. You have more authority over Azkaban than almost anyone. I can arrange a visit, she said. I want to review the original case file first. Everything. Not the summary, the primary evidence, the witness statements, the forensic magic reports. She paused. If what he's saying is possible, you want to know before you go in, Harry said. I want to understand what I'm walking into. He nodded. Then he picked the letter up again and read it a third time, and she knew what he was reading, not the information, he'd already absorbed that. He was reading the person. The quality of the voice, the specific way someone wrote when they'd been living in a particular kind of dark for 11 years and were trying to be clear rather than desperate. He sounds sane, Harry said. Yes, she said. He does. She spent 3 days going through the original Black case file, and what she found was exactly what Harry had identified in the atrium 3 weeks earlier, a case built on assumption, witness accounts of a scene interpreted in one direction because one direction was obvious and nobody had been in a position to look for another. 13 muggles dead in a street blast. Pettigrew's finger, the only physical remain. Sirius Black standing in the street laughing. Laughing. Not running, not crying, not threatening. Laughing. She'd seen that detail when she first looked at the file years ago and she'd filed it under shock response and moved on. Looking at it now, with 11 years more experience and a very different understanding of the case, she thought, or grief. The specific, broken grief that comes out wrong. The response of someone who has just understood that he has lost everything and the world will never know. The Pettigrew evidence was thin in retrospect. One finger. Magic could produce one finger. And the Fidelius records, Harry had found them correctly, did show the secret keeper switch, 1 week prior, from Black to Pettigrew. If Pettigrew had been the secret keeper, he was the one who could have told Voldemort. Not Sirius Black. And if Pettigrew had staged his own death in that street, killed 12 muggles to create chaos, severed his own finger, and transformed, she sat with that logic for a long time. Pettigrew had been an animagus. She found it in the Hogwarts records, a footnote in the Transfiguration Department notes from 1976, a reference to 3 students who had achieved animagus transformation under Professor McGonagall's supervision. James Potter, a stag. Sirius Black, a large black dog. Peter Pettigrew, a rat. A rat. She put the file down and sat in her office in the December dark and thought about where a rat could have been for 11 years. She called Proudfoot. She called McGonagall. She called Augusta. And then, because there was no version of this that didn't include him, she called Harry. He came into the office, looked at her face, looked at the file spread across the desk, and said, "You found something." "Sit down," she said. She walked him through it. All of it, the evidence, the animagus connection, the logic of what Pettigrew might have done. He listened without interruption, which was not always how he listened. When something surprised him he sometimes stopped her with a question, but tonight he let it all come and absorbed it in sequence, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "Where is he?" Harry said. "Pettigrew. If he transformed and ran, we don't know. But a rat animagus could be anywhere. He could be living as a pet, living wild, living, she stopped. We have to be careful about how this unfolds. If Pettigrew knows we're looking, he runs. And he's been hiding successfully for 11 years, which means he's careful and he has resources, or someone is protecting him. Someone is protecting him, Harry said. It wasn't a question. Probably. Voldemort's remaining people, Harry said. The ones who know the truth would want Pettigrew found. The ones who were loyal to Voldemort would want him hidden. He looked at the file. It connects back to the Malfoy investigation. Everything connects to the Malfoy investigation, she said. Which means the Malfoy investigation needs to move faster. He looked at her. Can we go to Azkaban before Christmas? She looked at the calendar on her desk. 4 days until Christmas. The prison on its island in the North Sea, the Dementors, the specific bleakness of a facility that had never been designed for anything other than permanent custody. Yes, she said. The day after tomorrow. Azkaban in December was a particular variety of terrible. The water was iron gray and the island rose from it with the physical quality of something that had decided to be inhospitable and had been consistent about it. The ferry crossing took 40 minutes, and Harry stood at the bow rather than sitting in the enclosed cabin, which she suspected was a preference developed from the specific way he engaged with difficult things, straight at them, open-eyed. He was wearing the warmest robe she'd found for him, and his breath steamed in the December sea air, and he looked at the island growing larger in the crossing without flinching. The Dementors were bad. She'd known they would be and she'd warned him, but warning about Dementors and experiencing them were different categories of preparation. She felt the cold hit at the gates, the specific cold that wasn't temperature, the cold that reached for the things you wanted least to revisit, and she had her Patronus cast before it reached full effect. A falcon, silver-white, sweeping the air above the gate. Harry, beside her, went still for about 3 seconds. She could see him recognizing the effect, cataloging it, understanding it from the inside, registering the specific content it was trying to surface. And then he held out his holly wand and cast a Patronus. She hadn't taught him. Babbling hadn't taught him, it wasn't on the curriculum, was technically NEWT level work. He cast it anyway, the way he did most things, because the situation required it and his magic understood what was needed before he'd consciously articulated the spell. It came out large. Larger than hers. A stag, silver-white and fully formed, standing so solid it seemed to displace the air around it, and for a moment something happened to Harry's face, not the usual controlled processing, but genuine shock, immediate and unguarded. He looked at the stag. My father, he said quietly. His animagus form was a stag. She hadn't told him that. She'd told him about James Potter, his courage, his friendship, the Quidditch, the war, but she hadn't known about the animagus until 3 days ago in the case file, and she hadn't had the chance to mention it. He was looking at his Patronus with an expression she'd only seen in pieces before, something wholly unguarded, the control down completely, a boy who had never known his father looking at the shape his grief and love and memory took when his magic was asked to protect him. She let it sit. The stag turned its silver head toward Harry, and Harry reached out and his hand passed through the light of it, and his expression did something she was going to be careful with, going to keep for herself, private and significant, not reduced to a report. After a moment he lowered his hand. The control reassembled. He looked at her, and there was something new in his expression that had come forward and settled and wasn't going back. Okay, he said. Let's go in. They walked through the gates with their patronuses sweeping ahead, past the guards, through corridors that had the quality of a building designed by something that fundamentally misunderstood human beings. The head warden, a tight-faced wizard named Dawlish who treated Amelia's authority with the particular resentment of someone who had been told what to do in his own space, led them to the cell block without conversation. Sirius Black was in a cell on the 3rd level. He was sitting on the floor when they came to the door, sitting with his back against the wall and his knees up and his head back, which was the particular posture of someone who had found the most sustainable position for a very long occupation and maintained it. He looked up when the door opened. He was not what she'd expected. The photographs from 1981 showed a young man with the particular dark handsomeness of the Black family line, strong features, wild hair, and easy quality that suggested someone who moved through the world. Claude Sonnet 4.